Hey guys, tonight we are slipping into a world where the air is thin enough to make you lightheaded, the mountains look like they've been carved by a patient giant, and every step feels like it comes with a free calf workout. You're in Lhasa, though if you were actually here right now, without a few weeks of acclimating, you probably wouldn't survive this thin mountain air. The streets below are still dark, but the ridgelines are brushed with the faintest streak of gray-blue, like a watercolor someone hasn't finished yet. In the shadowed kitchen around you, the smell of soot and cold stone mixes with the faint tang of yak butter from yesterday's tea. The kettle on the stove has started its shy, slow exhale, just a whisper of steam curling up into the cool morning stillness. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shift your feet on the packed earth floor, feeling that quiet vibration of a city that hasn't woken yet. Outside, the wind sighs down the alley, nudging a loose prayer flag so it flutters just once, an impatient reminder that the weather here doesn't wait for anyone. Through the warped window pane, you can just make out the outline of rooftops stacked like a child's mismatched blocks, some with frost crusted on their edges. Farther away, the great gold crown of the Jokhang Temple's roof catches the first glint of morning, as if some hidden hand has decided now is the time to turn the lights on in the sky. Your breath comes out in little puffs, and you pull your worn wool shawl tighter. In the far corner of the kitchen, the hearth crouches low and blackened, its mouth lined with stones polished by years of heat. There's no electric hum here, just the small hiss of the kettle and the occasional pop from a half-burned splinter of wood you tucked into the fuel pit last night. You move slowly, because mornings at this altitude don't encourage rushing. The bones of the house, thick walls of mud brick, hold onto the night's chill like they're reluctant to give it up. You know that in a little while, the sun will flood the room so fiercely you'll have to peel layers off, but right now, you're still wrapped in winter. You remember your grandmother saying that the first cup of butter tea wasn't just a drink, it was a promise. A promise that the day ahead would be warm enough, that your hands would be steady enough, that you'd have the energy to cross whatever icy threshold the world threw at you. Historians still argue whether butter tea came to Tibet from Mongolia with horse-riding traders, or if it was born in these high valleys out of pure necessity. Either way, it's hard to imagine a morning without it. The street dogs outside are still sleeping, curled into themselves under the overhang of a shuttered shop. Somewhere, a rooster tries out a hesitant crow, like it's checking if anyone else is awake yet. You smile at the sound. It's not much different from the rooster back in your childhood courtyard, except that here, the cry echoes off the stone walls and vanishes into the mountain air like a dropped pebble into a deep well. In the kitchen, your eyes rest on the wooden churn leaning against the wall, its surface dark with age and smooth from decades of use. It almost feels alive. You know from experience that the churn will be your companion for the better part of the day, silent most of the time, but singing softly when the tea and butter meet inside it. You could swear the rhythm it makes changes with the weather. A tiny spider has spun a web in the upper right corner of the window. In the glow of the first light, it glitters faintly, each thread trembling when the kettle lets out a stronger hiss. You're tempted to brush it away, but you leave it, because there's something reassuring about small creatures also starting their day in this little room. Your fingers trace the grain of the countertop, each groove holding its own quiet archive. This kitchen has seen traders passing through, neighbors stopping by for warmth, monks chanting in the doorway. It's the kind of space where history feels less like a textbook and more like something you can inhale. You let your gaze wander to the mountains on the horizon. In the distance, the Padala Palace sits high above the city, a massive white and red fortress that once held the Dalai Lamas and still seems to hold the clouds themselves. You've heard stories about how butter tea was served there not just for comfort, but as part of ceremonial duties, guests given a steaming bowl as a welcome, the rich drink a silent message, "You're safe here, at least for now." A strange little fact drifts into your thoughts. Early travelers wrote about butter tea as though it were a dare. Some described the taste as soup made of warm milk and salt, others swore it was liquid cheese. One Victorian visitor even claimed you could stand your spoon upright in it, not entirely true, but a detail that makes you grin. Your eyes fall on the kettle again. The steam is thicker now, curling lazily toward the low, dark rafters. Soon you'll add the brick tea leaves, the kind that look like chunks of pressed earth, and watch them break apart into inky strands. But for this moment, you simply stand there, breathing in the scent of water meeting metal, feeling the gentle tug of a day that's about to begin in full. You wonder, not for the first time, if people in warmer places could ever understand this ritual. In those low, sea-level cities, mornings might be about coffee that jolts you awake, about the rush to get somewhere. Here, mornings are about coaxing warmth into your bones, about letting the first light paint its way slowly into your kitchen, about a kettle that doesn't shout but hums. And maybe that's the real magic, that in a world where most people are chasing something, you are just here, waiting for the dawn to finish unwrapping itself over Lesau's rooftops, knowing the tea will be ready soon, and that, for now, there is nowhere else you need to be. You crouch near the hearth, the rough wool of your shawl brushing the dusty floor, and at a pile of yak dung patties stacked neatly in the corner. They're the color of sun-baked clay, each one shaped by a practiced hand and dried under the relentless mountain sun. You pick one up, it's surprisingly light, almost like holding a thick piece of cork. To an outsider, the idea of burning this for fuel might sound like the punchline to a bad travel joke, but here, it's simply what works. Wood is scarce this high up, and coal has to be hauled in at a price that makes your jaw tighten. The dome, though? Always ready, always steady. With a practiced flick of your wrist, you slide a fresh patty into the hearth, nudging it toward the glowing remnants of last night's fire. The smell is earthy, not unpleasant, like the after-rain scent of a field in late summer. You strike a match, the sulfur biting your nose for just a second before the flame catches and licks greedily at the dry surface. Slowly, the fire wakes up, its orange eyes blinking wider with each crackle. There's something hypnotic about this part, feeding the flames, feeling them breathe. The way the warmth seeps into your knuckles, coaxing stiffness out of your fingers, is as steadying as the first deep breath after a long day. You lean close, listening to the little pops and sighs the patties give as they burn. It's not the roaring inferno of a wood fire, this is a slow, dignified heat, the kind that stays loyal for hours. You remember hearing once that early Tibetan households didn't have chimneys. The smoke would just curl up and out through gaps in the roof, blackening everything above it. Historians still argue whether that was an intentional choice for insulation or simply a side effect of building with what was available. Either way, the older houses still have rafters as dark as burnt toast, like your grandmother's, where every beam told a century of smoky stories. The kettle's metal sides start to ping softly as the water inside warms. You lean back, stretching your legs, and glance out the window again. The rooftops are brighter now, the frost on them catching light like scattered sugar. Somewhere nearby, you hear the faint clink of a door latch, then the shuffle of feet as a neighbor steps into the day. It's tempting to romanticize all of this, how peaceful it seems, but you know that coaxing a fire here isn't always this smooth. You've had mornings when the dung patties were too damp, when the matches snapped, when your breath turned ragged in the cold before the flame even thought about catching. And then there's the smoke. One puff the wrong way and you're coughing hard enough to scare the kitchen cats. Still, you keep at it, because without fire, there's no tea, and without tea, well, let's just say your day wouldn't go nearly as kindly. You reach over to the small wooden box near the hearth. Inside are slivers of juniper wood, rare and precious, saved for mornings when you want the scent to twist with the steam. You take one, place it carefully among the burning patties, and watch as a thin, sweet-smelling smoke rises. It's the sort of scent that feels like it belongs to this altitude, like it couldn't possibly smell the same anywhere else. Somewhere deep in the kettle, the water shifts, the first shy stirrings before a boil. You take the brick of tea from its cloth wrap and hold it in your palm. It's dense and heavy, as if it's been pressed with secrets. The surface is rough, studded with bits of leaf and stem. You know traders once carried these bricks along the tea horse road, swapping them for salt, wool, and sometimes even horses. There's a half-joking saying among old-timers here that a tea brick could pay you for a bride if you had the right connections. You're not sure if that's true, but it makes for a good story. You break off a piece with the blunt edge of a small knife, the snap loud in the quiet kitchen. The smell is faint but earthy, like a pile of dry leaves that's been sleeping through the winter. You drop the chunk into the kettle and watch it sink, tiny bubbles clinging to its sides before they pop free and race upward. There's a meditative patience to this stage. The water darkens slowly, the leaves loosening their grip and unfurling with the same lazy grace of a cat stretching in sunlight. You stir gently with a long-handled spoon, not to rush it, but to keep the process even. You know that if you're careless here, if you let the heat get too wild or the tea too thin, the whole balance will be off later when the butter and salt come in. And then there's the quiet, the kind that's not entirely silent. It's layered with the sound of the kettle breathing, the occasional shuffle of the fire, and the distant chime of a monastery bell marking a new hour. You let that sound settle into you, a reminder that life here moves with its own steady rhythm, whether you're keeping pace or not. In the low light, you can see your breath hanging in the air, mingling with the first curls of tea steam. You've always liked how the two look almost the same until they drift apart. A small thought crosses your mind, one of those sleepy, unnecessary thoughts that if someone painted this moment, they might not even notice the difference. You reach for the wooden ladle hanging from the wall. It's smooth, worn thin from decades of stirring and scooping. Your grandmother's hand once wrapped around this same handle, and hers before her. There's no logo, no brand name, just the grain of the wood and the knowledge that if you dropped it, the world might keep spinning, but your tea wouldn't taste quite right. The boil deepens, the dark liquid rolling over itself. Soon, you'll strain it, add the butter, and start the churn's quiet song. But for now, you sit back on your heels, warming your palms near the hearth and watching the fire's orange glow dance in the reflection of the kettle's side. It's a small show, meant for an audience of one. And in this moment, before the clatter of bowls, before the chatter of guests, before the salt stings the tip of your tongue, you realize that the fire's slow birth is as much a part of the ritual as the tea itself. Without it, there would be no warmth, no steam, no soft hum of the kettle. Only the cold, and the mountains, and the long, empty morning. The kettle's low murmur has settled into a steady, confident boil, and now comes the part you secretly look forward to, the butter. You pad over to the wooden cupboard against the far wall, its door held shut with a loop of worn string. Inside, the shelves are cool from the night air, and on the middle one sits a round, wrapped bundle of pale yellow, glowing faintly in the dim light. You untie the thin strip of cloth holding it closed and peel it back. There it is, a solid mass of yak butter, smooth on the outside but with tiny ridges where your knife has skimmed slices in mornings past. The smell rises immediately, richer and more assertive than cow's butter, almost sweet, with a faint echo of grass and wind. You remember the herders saying the flavor changes with the seasons, summer butter, bright and fragrant from fresh grazing, winter butter, denser and deeper, the yak's diet having shifted to stored fodder. Historians still argue whether this seasonal variation was ever deliberately sought after or simply a natural result of the herding cycle. Either way, you've learned to tell them apart without even tasting. You pick up the short-handled butter knife, its edge dulled from years of service, and press it into the block. It resists for a heartbeat before yielding, and you lift away a thick, generous slab. The knife leaves a clean trail behind, the kind you want to smooth over with your finger but resist, barely. You place the butter on a small wooden plate, its surface glistening faintly in the low light. A small fact pops into your mind. In some older villages, butter wasn't just food, it was currency. People traded it for wool, for tools, even for tea bricks themselves. There's a story about a family who paid their taxes entirely in butter, loading it into carved wooden boxes as if it were gold. Whether it's true or just one of those tales people tell to pass the time by the fire, you can't say, but it sticks in your mind whenever you see a particularly fine, golden slab. The kettle hisses as if reminding you it's still here, working. You bring the butter closer, holding it above the steam for a moment so its edges soften. A few drops of condensation kiss the surface, gliding down and leaving tiny streaks. You smile to yourself. Yes, you could just toss it in now, but there's an art to letting the butter come alive a little before it meets the tea. Your hands know the next steps without your mind telling them. You set the butter aside and reach for the long wooden spoon again, giving the tea a slow stir. The leaves have surrendered fully now, turning the water into a deep, opaque brown that looks almost like polished wood. You lean over the kettle, breathing in that earthy scent, feeling it fill your lungs in a way coffee never could. Then, with care, you ladle some of the hot tea into a tall wooden churn standing nearby. The churn is as tall as your forearm, its inside faintly stained from years of buttered tea swirling through it. The wood is warm under your touch, the kind of warmth that feels alive. You tip in the slab of butter, it hits the tea with a quiet plop, sinking halfway before the heat begins to coax it into golden rivulets. You remember your grandmother telling you that butter tea without enough butter wasn't butter tea at all, it was just salty leaf water. She'd say it with a mock frown, then slip in another spoonful, for the ancestors. She also swore that the best butter for tea came from milk churned on days when the wind blew from the east. Why the east? She'd just shrug. Some things don't need reasons, they just are. You cut another slice from the block and add it in, watching the tea's surface ripple. The smell changes subtly now, still earthy, but richer, more rounded. You can almost taste it before it touches your lips. A little thought flits through your head. Early explorers used to write about the way Tibetans consumed astonishing amounts of butter in their tea, as if it were some sort of marvel or oddity. They didn't always understand that in the thin, cold air, calories aren't just a luxury, they're a necessity. The butter is an indulgence, it's insulation. The churn waits patiently. Soon you'll close the lid, take hold of the long, vertical handle, and begin the slow, rhythmic plunge that turns this mix into something more than the sum of its parts. But for now, you linger a moment longer over the butter, the way it catches the light, the way the tea cradles it like a secret. In the quiet, you notice the fire has settled into a steady orange glow, the yak dung patties breaking down into a soft, powdery ash. You nudge them slightly with the poker, not out of need but out of habit. A small act of tending. The kitchen, the butter, the fire, they're all breathing together now, and you're just one more part of that rhythm. And as you glance at the remaining block of butter, wrapped and waiting for tomorrow, you feel a little swell of satisfaction. This, right here, with steam on your face and the smell of butter and tea mingling, isn't just a step in a recipe. It's the hinge on which the whole day turns. You reach for the small ceramic jar on the corner shelf, its chipped blue glaze holding the memory of many mornings. Inside is your salt, coarse Himalayan crystals with a faint pink hue, each shard catching the light like a frozen spark. It's heavier in your hand than it looks, the grains clinking softly against the clay as you lift the lid. You don't pour this kind of salt like you might sprinkle table salt at dinner. Here, it's measured in deliberate pinches and gestures that have been repeated so many times you could do them in the dark. The steam from the churn-to-be is still warm on your cheek as you tip a few crystals into a small wooden cup. The sound is tiny but satisfying, the tink of mineral against wood, like the opening note of a song you know by heart. You swirl the cup gently, listening to the salt grains roll against each other, thinking about how they started their lives deep underground, long before this kitchen existed, before any kitchen in Lhasa existed. Some say the use of salt in tea came from necessity, minerals lost in the thin air and cold needed to be replaced. Historians still argue whether Tibetans learned the salted tea habit from their nomadic neighbors or if it arose here independently. Either way, you've never known anyone to question it. Butter tea without salt is like a story without an ending. You pour some hot water into the cup, watching the crystals vanish almost instantly, leaving nothing but a faint cloudiness behind. The brine is strong, salty enough to make your tongue flinch if you tasted it straight, but you know that once it joins the butter and tea, it will dissolve into something balanced, almost impossible to imagine any other way. It's funny how travelers sometimes wrinkle their noses at the idea. Salt? In tea, they'll say, their voices full of polite disbelief. And then you watch them take their first sip, watch the way their eyebrows twitch up just slightly when the warmth hits, and you know they'll never forget it. Some will even crave it later, though they might not admit it. You set the brine aside for a moment and think of an old story you once heard, a caravan trader who swore his horses could smell the salt in his tea from across camp, and would nudge their noses into his cup if he wasn't careful. It's probably nonsense, but the image of a tea-thieving horse is enough to make you smile. Back at the churn, the butter has softened further, little golden tendrils reaching into the dark tea. You pour the brine in slowly, letting it spread like an invisible thread weaving itself through the liquid. The smell changes again, subtle, but real. A faint edge, a sharper note, like the tea has just cleared its throat. The room is warmer now, though you can't tell if it's the fire, the steam, or the quiet satisfaction building in your chest. The firewood, or rather, the yak dung, has burned down to a steady bed of embers, glowing with that deep, almost hypnotic red. You glance outside briefly, and the day has taken a firmer hold of the city. The rooftops are brighter, and you catch the faint glint of sun on a distant rooftop stupa. Somewhere, a child's laughter drifts on the air. You think about how this salted tea has seen everything: births, deaths, long journeys, political changes, quiet afternoons. The same flavor you'll sip in a few minutes is one a high-altitude soldier might have gulped on a freezing outpost, or a monk might have cradled in both hands after a dawn prayer. The recipe isn't written anywhere formal, yet it's been memorized by generations without needing a single page. The churn is ready now. You take hold of its long wooden plunger and slide it in with care, feeling the warm resistance as it sinks through the butter-rich liquid. The handle fits your hands like it was made for them, though in truth, it was made for every hand that has ever churned here, each one leaving its own invisible imprint in the wood. You start slow, the first push sending a muted thunk into the air, followed by the sound of liquid folding over itself. The salted tea swirls in lazy spirals beneath the lid, the butter streaking out further with every motion. The rhythm is familiar: down, up, twist, repeat, like a heartbeat you've learned to keep time with. The fire crackles once in approval, or maybe it's just the patties settling. Either way, you take it as a sign to keep going. The tea inside the churn is changing now, becoming thicker, creamier, the salt binding with the butter in ways you can't see but can almost taste already. A little joke your uncle once told bubbles up in your mind: tea without salt is like a yak without hair, pointless and very, very cold. You'd rolled your eyes at him back then, but now you can't help but chuckle under your breath. As the briny, buttery aroma drapes itself over the kitchen, you know the moment is close. Soon you'll pour the tea into the first bowl of the day, the steam curling into the air like it's carrying the morning itself. And you'll take that first sip, where the salt doesn't stand out on its own but deepens everything else, the way shadows make light seem brighter. And all this, from a handful of pinkish crystals that, by themselves, taste almost too sharp to enjoy. Strange, isn't it, how the smallest thing can anchor the whole? The churn stands before you now, heavy with the promise of that first bowl, and it's time to give it a voice. You grip the smooth handle, your palms still warm from the fire, and push the plunger down slowly. The wood slides through the liquid with a low, satisfying glug, the sound like a muffled drumbeat in a far-off valley. Then you lift, feeling the resistance, dense yet silky, as the butter and tea swirl back up to meet you. It's a quiet music, this churn. Not the sharp clinks of metal on metal or the splashy slosh of careless stirring, but a steady, cushioned rhythm. Down. Up. Down. Up. Each stroke folds the salt deeper into the butter's richness, binding them into that texture no whisk or spoon could ever quite mimic. You fall into the rhythm easily, your body knows this dance better than your mind does. Some say the churn's design hasn't changed in hundreds of years, just a tall cylinder, usually wood, sometimes metal in newer homes, with a long vertical handle and a paddle at the bottom. Historians still argue whether the butter tea churn was adapted from tools used to make butter itself, or if it evolved separately just for this purpose. You don't really care about the scholarly verdict. What you know is that this one, your one, has been here longer than you have, and it fits into your life like it was born for it. The sound deepens as you work. Sometimes it's a low, throaty whump, sometimes a softer, breathy whoosh, depending on how the paddle catches the liquid. You've learned to listen for those changes. They tell you when the tea is thickening, when the butter has fully surrendered into the brew. You think back to the first time you tried churning on your own. You were too eager, slamming the plunger down like you were in a race, splattering tea all over the table. Your grandmother had laughed, not an unkind laugh, but the sort that said, "Yes, you'll do this better tomorrow." She'd taken the handle from you and slowed it down, showing you how the churn isn't about force, it's about coaxing. Like convincing a shy friend to come sit by the fire. The kitchen is warm now, a damp heat rising from the churn and curling against the windows, fogging the glass into soft blurs. You can't see the rooftops anymore, just patches of pale light where the sun hits, broken up by the shadow of prayer flags swaying outside. The thin air catches their edges, making them snap once in a while, like punctuation in the morning sentence. You notice how the steam smells richer than it did minutes ago. It's no longer just tea and butter, it's a unified scent, as if the two have agreed to stop competing and work together. You know that when you pour the first ladleful, there will be no slick of butter floating on top, no uneven taste. The churn has made them one thing, as inseparable as mountain and shadow. There's a small superstition you've never quite shaken, that if the churn squeaks, it means the tea will spill before it's served. Today, it's silent except for its deep liquid voice, so you take that as a good omen. You work the handle in steady strokes, your wrists finding their natural rhythm. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you keep time with the slow clang of a distant monastery bell. You remember an odd little fact someone once told you. In some nomadic camps, the churn wasn't just for tea. It was also used to hide valuables, small coins, jewelry, because nobody ever thought to look inside something that smelled like warm butter. You're not sure if you believe it, but the thought of a churn doubling as a treasure chest is strangely appealing. Your arms begin to feel the weight now, not heavy enough to tire you, but enough to remind you this is work, however gentle it seems. You shift your stance, letting your hips take some of the motion, and the churn responds with a low, steady whump. You picture the tea swirling inside, folding over itself, the butter ribbons now fully dissolved, the salt wrapped evenly through every drop. After several more minutes, the sound changes again, it becomes softer, rounder, almost shy. That's how you know it's ready. The churn has done its part, the rest belongs to the bowls and the hands that will hold them. You lift the plunger out slowly, careful not to drip too much on the table, and rest it against the wall. The tea inside is smooth now, its surface a soft, even brown with a faint sheen of warmth. You run a ladle through it once, just to watch the way it closes in behind the curve of the wood, no streaks, no separation, just one complete, silky hole. You let your hands rest for a moment, enjoying the quiet after the churn's song. It's a bit like the silence after rain, when the air feels full but calm. In a moment, you'll pour the tea into that first porcelain bowl, and the day will truly begin. But for now, you stand in the warmth, listening to the echo of the churn in your muscles, thinking about how even in the simplest of sounds, there's a kind of music if you know how to hear it. You lean your elbows on the windowsill for a moment, the ladle still warm in your hand, and peer out through the steam-fogged glass. It's a blurred painting at first, gray-white swirls and soft shapes, but as you rub a small circle clear with your sleeve, the world outside comes into focus. Frost clings to the wooden eaves like spun sugar, and beyond them, the rooftops of Lhasa huddle close together, their edges softened by the lingering mist. You draw a little shape on the fogged glass with your fingertip, first a rough yak, then a swirl that could be a butter churn. You laugh at yourself quietly, the yak looks more like a lopsided sheep, but you leave it there anyway. The warmth of your finger leaves a bright outline in the fog, a small sign of life in the still morning. The window is a storyteller of its own. It catches moments without words, the flutter of prayer flags strung across the alley, the faint shadow of a woman carrying a basket on her back, the drifting plume of smoke from another kitchen fire somewhere nearby. The smell of your tea mingles with the faint trace of incense drifting in from the shrine corner, a reminder that for some, this day will begin not with a sip, but with a prayer. You remember reading once about how brick tea traveled here from the Chinese province of Sichuan, pressed hard into heavy blocks so it wouldn't spoil or crumble on the long journey over snow-choked passes. Traders would load the bricks onto mule trains or stack them onto the backs of yaks, each step up those treacherous trails creaking under the weight. Historians still argue whether the tea reached Tibet first through formal trade routes or through smaller, more secret exchanges along the borderlands. Either way, by the time it arrived in kitchens like yours, it was no longer just a commodity, it was part of the rhythm of daily life. Your eyes follow the imaginary path of one of those caravans across the glass. You picture them stopping for the night in a narrow valley, the wind tugging at their blankets, the animals shifting restlessly. Somewhere, someone would light a small fire, break off a piece of that tea brick, and start the same ritual you've just finished, boiling, adding butter, adding salt, turning the hard, bitter leaf into a liquid shield against the cold. The glass fogs over again as your breath leans into it, erasing your yak drawing. You take that as a cue to turn back to the hearth, where the churn waits patiently. The kitchen has grown even warmer now, enough that you loosen your shawl. The fire is steady, the patties reduced to a fine ash, and the kettle lets out the occasional contented sigh, as if it's relieved to have done its job for the morning. The steam rises in lazy plumes from the churn's open top, curling toward the rafters. You think of how this same sight must have greeted countless mornings before yours, how many pairs of eyes have watched steam dance in this kitchen. And not just here, in every home across the plateau, in every tent in the high pastures, someone has stood with a bowl or a ladle in hand, waiting for tea to be ready. Your grandmother used to tell you that if you stared into the steam long enough, you could see faces, ancestors, perhaps, or travelers passing through. You'd squint until your eyes watered, trying to catch the moment when the vapor folded into something human. You never truly saw them, but you pretended you did, just to hear her laugh and pat your shoulder. A small, quirky thought crosses your mind. Somewhere, there must have been a time when people first started making shapes in fogged glass, and maybe they, too, thought they were the first to do it. A quiet little tradition that nobody had to invent, just a natural thing to do when the world gives you a temporary canvas. You take the ladle and stir the tea once more, not because it needs it, but because you want to see the way the surface ripples under the soft morning light. It catches the glow from the hearth, turning the brown liquid into something warmer, almost like polished bronze. Outside, the faint clop of hooves on stone echoes up the alley. You imagine it might be one of those mule trains from your daydream, but more likely it's just a neighbor's pony heading to market. Either way, the sound blends perfectly with the kitchen's own music, the faint creak of wood, the hiss of steam, the occasional pop from the embers. You step away from the window and set the ladle down gently. The first pour is coming soon, but before that, you give yourself one last moment to breathe in the view, the rooftops, the prayer flags, the lights slowly swallowing the shadows, and to feel the connection between all those mornings, past and present, linked by the same fog on the glass, the same steam in the air, and the same waiting bowl. The moment arrives with the tiniest of gestures, a hand on the ladle, a tilt of the wrist. You dip deep into the churn, feeling the slight resistance of the thickened tea against the bowl of the ladle, and lift it carefully. Steam rolls off the surface in twisting banners, curling toward your face and fogging your lashes for a heartbeat. The first pour is always the most important, though no one can quite agree why. Some say it's because the very first bowl carries the strongest flavor, having drawn straight from the heart of the mixture before it settles again. Others believe the first pour is symbolic, an offering to ancestors, or a blessing for the household. Historians still argue whether this tradition began as a formal spiritual practice or simply as a pragmatic way to test the brew before serving everyone else. Either way, you know better than to take it lightly. You steady the ceramic bowl under the ladle and let the liquid arc into it. The sound is different from water, it's a denser splash, almost a slow gulp, the kind of sound that feels like it could warm your bones just by hearing it. The butter tea swirls as it lands, a soft spiral of brown and gold that slowly evens out into a glossy surface. Tiny bubbles cling to the edge, catching the firelight. You bring the bowl close to your lips, but not to drink, yet. Instead, you hold it just beneath your chin and let the steam roll upward, breathing in the faint smokiness from the brick tea, the richness of the butter, the hint of salt that sharpens everything else. It's astonishing how something so humble, a leaf, some milk fat, a pinch of salt, can smell like an entire landscape. There's the grassy whisper of summer pastures, the ghost of the high passes where the tea once traveled, even the subtle bite of the cold air outside. A little joke slips into your mind. If modern coffee shops bottled this aroma, they'd call it something like Snowy Yak Morning and charge you extra for the authentic foam. You smile at the thought, but in truth, no city menu could capture the way this moment feels, because it's not just about scent, it's about place, about knowing the wind outside would freeze your fingers if you lingered too long without a warm cup. You take the tiniest sip, just enough to test. The first touch on your tongue is shockingly salty, almost like the ocean, if the ocean were wrapped in velvet. Then the butter floods in, coating your mouth, tempering the tea's sharpness into something rounder, deeper. The warmth slides down your throat and pools low in your chest, radiating outward until even your toes feel less like frozen pebbles and more like part of a living body again. This first sip isn't just a test, it's a signal. You turn to the low wooden table, where two smaller bowls wait, and pour for the others in the room. In this imagined morning, maybe it's family still shaking off sleep, or a friend who arrived early from a neighboring house. They take their bowls with both hands, murmuring thanks. You notice the way they lean forward slightly, as though to get closer to the steam, to disappear into it. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you recall reading about how, during certain festivals, entire neighborhoods in Lesaw would share tea in great communal gatherings, with huge churns kept warm over open fires. People would drift from one to another, bowls in hand, trading jokes or news while the steam wrapped them all in a single soft cloud. The first pour in such settings wasn't just for tasting, it was a moment of welcome, a way of saying you're part of this warmth now. You ladle another bowl for yourself, noticing that the tea has already begun to settle a little in the churn. The butter's creamy top layer shifts lazily, and you give it a gentle stir to wake it. That's the trick with butter tea, it's alive in its own way, always changing in the minutes after it's made, so you have to treat it like company rather than an object. Outside the window, a shaft of pale sunlight slips between the rooftops, landing right on the table. It glints off the rim of your bowl, making the tea inside glow faintly. You almost laugh again, because it looks like someone tried to turn warmth itself into a drink, and succeeded. A soft clatter comes from the doorway, and you glance over to see a neighbor stepping in with a shy smile. They've brought something wrapped in cloth, maybe a few barley cakes, maybe a handful of dried fruit, and you wave them toward the table. Without asking, you ladle them a full bowl and slide it across. In this ritual, there's no stinginess, no counting portions. As long as the churn is warm, the tea flows freely. You take another sip, and in the gentle pause afterward, you feel the unspoken truth of this moment. The first pour might be for tasting, but every pour after is for connection. It's the same logic that kept travelers alive in the high passes that still keeps families close through long winters. Butter tea isn't just consumed, it's shared, bowl to bowl, sip to sip, until the chill outside feels like it belongs to another world entirely. By now, the churn has taken on that comfortable hum of a task in progress, like a record turning quietly in the background, always there but never loud enough to intrude. You've poured the first few bowls, and the tea has found its rhythm, thick and steady, no longer just a mixture but a presence in the room. This is where the sharing truly begins. Not just giving someone a bowl, but watching them take it in their hands, fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic, shoulders relaxing almost instantly. You pass the tea first to the eldest in the room, not because anyone told you to, but because it feels right. There's an unspoken pecking order here, one that's less about status and more about acknowledging whose stories you've been drinking in your whole life. The eldest lifts the bowl to their lips, but they don't gulp. No, they take a slow, deliberate sip, eyes half closed, as though they're listening for something inside the flavor. You've seen this before, people treating tea like an oracle. Historians still argue whether the origins of butter tea in Tibet were tied directly to early monastic life or whether it began purely as a nomadic survival drink and later found its spiritual footing. Watching them now, you'd believe either version. The bowl comes back down, a faint smear of butter clinging to the rim, and you take that as your cue to pour for the next person. They're younger, impatient, their hands almost trembling, not from cold, but from eagerness. You can't help but grin and think about how, in certain high mountain villages, butter tea is given to children the way some families elsewhere might offer warm milk, comfort disguised as a daily staple. As each bowl makes its way to new hands, the air in the room changes. Conversations begin to swell in little pockets, someone talking about the weather in a way that's really about the crops, someone else leaning in to share a story that dips in and out of whispers. There's a rhythm to it, like weaving, a thread of warmth from the tea, another of words, another of shared glances across the room. You know from reading some obscure anthropological note that in the past, travelers along the tea horse road might stop in remote households, and the first thing offered wasn't a bed or even food, it was tea. Not just a polite gesture, but a signal, you've made it through the cold, and you're safe here for now. The guest would sip, the host would sip, and in that small act, a bridge formed between strangers. You take a moment for yourself, ladling another bowl, feeling the smooth ceramic warm against your palms. The flavor is slightly deeper now, the butter binding more thoroughly with the tea as it sits. You remember to give the churn a gentle stir before every pour, the motion so ingrained now it's practically muscle memory. Outside, you can hear the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow. Another visitor? The thought makes you chuckle. Either the tea has a magnetic pull, or you've just managed to live in the kind of place where everyone knows when the churn is going. You glance toward the door as it opens, and sure enough, another figure slips inside, cheeks pink from the cold, stamping their boots. You greet them without words, just a nod toward the table and the ladle in your hand. The first sip they take is always the same, a small, almost cautious taste, followed by that inevitable moment when the salt and fat and warmth hit all at once. Shoulders loosen, eyes brighten, like a thaw in fast motion. You've joked before that butter tea works faster than Wi-Fi in bringing people together, and honestly, it's not far from the truth. The churn starts to feel lighter, and you know you'll have to make more soon. But there's no rush. Part of the beauty of this ritual is that it unfolds at the pace of conversation. Some people drink quickly, others cradle their bowls for ages, letting the tea cool just enough to sip without steam fogging their vision. You refill a few empty bowls, your movements now so automatic you can keep your eyes on the people instead. There's a quiet satisfaction in seeing them drink, laugh, gesture with hands that occasionally flick butter droplets onto the table. The surface glows with small rings where bowls have been set down, little halos of warmth. Somewhere, a child bursts into laughter at something you missed, and the sound hangs in the air like the steam itself, light, drifting, unable to be caught but still somehow shared by everyone. You think about how these moments are impossible to replicate exactly. Tomorrow's tea will be slightly different. The conversations will drift to other topics. The guests may change. But the ritual, the flow of pour, sip, smile, will remain. The churn hums in your hands as you stir again, bringing the butter up from the depths to rejoin the tea. You like to think of it as coaxing everything back into harmony, a reminder that even when things settle apart, a gentle touch can bring them together again. And as you hand over another steaming bowl, you catch yourself hoping the next footsteps outside are already on their way. By the time the churn is nearly empty, the room has mellowed into that late afternoon lull. Half the bowls are resting on the low table, a few people have leaned back against the walls with half-lit eyes, and the conversations have slowed into long, comfortable pauses. You top off the last bowl from this batch, knowing you'll need to make another soon, and slide it toward the quietest person in the room. They nod their thanks without breaking their thoughtful stare into the steam. You stand, stretch your back just enough to feel the joints loosen, and head toward the storeroom where the next round of leaves and butter are waiting. It's cooler in here, the air tinged with the faint sharpness of dried tea bricks stacked neatly against the wall. You run your fingers over the textured surfaces, compressed leaves that, once upon a time, were currency on the tea horse road. Mainstream historians say these bricks traveled hundreds of miles on yak caravans, traded for salt, wool, or even war horses, but you once read a fringe account that claimed they were occasionally used as makeshift roof tiles in emergencies. You can't decide whether that's desperate ingenuity or just terrible roofing. Pulling down a brick, you carry it to the preparation table. The weight feels reassuring in your hands, solid and dependable. You chip off the amount you'll need for this batch. There's no measuring here, just an intuitive sense that comes from repetition. The pieces fall into your pot with a soft clink, ready to steep. You pour in fresh water, watching the first tiny whirls of color bloom as the leaves begin to loosen. While the tea brews, you head for the wooden butter churn. The carved handle feels smooth from years of use, like the grip of an old walking stick. You take a block of butter from the cool shelf, its pale surface glistening faintly in the low light, and cut it into thick slabs. The smell is rich and almost sweet, a scent you've learned to associate with calm evenings and steady hands. Someone calls your name from the other room, their voice just loud enough to cut through the simmering hiss of the pot. You answer with a quick, almost ready. A phrase that in this house has come to mean give me 15 more minutes and don't rush me. The butter goes into the churn first, followed by a ladle of tea strong enough to nearly stain the wood. You close the lid, grip the handle, and begin the steady up and down motion that will coax the fat and liquid into a smooth, velvety union. Outside, the faint crunch of boots on snow tells you someone else is approaching. The door swings open, and a swirl of icy air creeps in along with the newcomer. They shake off the snow from their shoulders, stamping their boots, and make their way toward the warmth. You can tell by their face, they're here for tea before they're here for conversation. You point toward the low table, wordlessly promising that something hot is coming their way. Your arms settle into a rhythm with the churn. The motion is almost meditative, up, twist, down, lift. You remember once hearing that in certain monasteries, butter tea preparation was given as a daily practice to novices, partly to teach patience and partly because everyone needed to drink it anyway. Historians still argue whether that tradition was purely practical or if it held deeper symbolic meaning about blending strength and gentleness. The smell changes first, becoming fuller, almost round in its warmth, and then the texture shifts. You pour a small sample into a bowl and give it a stir. The butter clings perfectly to the surface, no oily separation, just a golden sheen that catches the dim light like a promise. Carrying the first few bowls out, you see the way people instinctively lean forward, hands ready. The new arrival takes theirs with a faint shiver of relief, cupping it close to their chest before taking the first sip. You watch the moment it hits, how their eyes close just long enough to let the warmth spread through them. You refill the bowls that have been set down empty, keeping the churn close so you can move between the rooms without losing heat. The atmosphere shifts again, voices lifting, stories resuming, the subtle energy that comes whenever fresh tea appears. One older man begins telling a tale about the time he carried a half-filled churn over a mountain pass in a snowstorm. You've heard it before, but you still enjoy the part where he claims the churn kept his heart from freezing. Whether he means physically or metaphorically changes depending on how much tea he's had. As the bowls make their rounds, you notice a small spill on the table, a perfect ring where butter tea has pooled. Instead of wiping it away immediately, you leave it for now, liking the way it catches the light. A tiny record of the moment, soon to be gone but, for now, quietly part of the scene. When the chatter dips into another pause, you ease back into your spot near the churn, fingers lightly tapping the wooden rim. It's still warm, still full, and still ready to serve. You let the quiet sit for a moment, letting everyone's breath sink with the steady hum of the room. The day outside might still be cold and uncertain, but in here, with the tea moving from hand to hand, there's nothing to fix, nothing to hurry. You glance toward the window, half expecting to see another shadow in the snow. If they come, there will be enough. There's always enough when you make it like this. You don't even realize how the hours have folded into one another until the shadows on the floor start to stretch long and thin. That slow drift of light across the stone reminds you that this is the perfect time to prepare the last big serving before the evening chill sets in. Outside, the sky has that pre-dusk softness, the clouds settling into muted golds and pale violets, and you can feel the temperature slip just a little with each passing minute. The churn is lighter now, nearly empty, but the butter smell still lingers thick in the air, warm, heavy, reassuring. You set it down on the bench, give it a quick rinse with hot water so no old bits cling, and lay out the fresh ingredients. This is the part you've secretly come to love most, not the pouring, not the drinking, but the prelude, when the tea is just an idea in the steam and not yet in anyone's bowl. From the storage shelf, you select another tea brick. Its surface is worn with age, edges rounded in places, the compression marks like faint fingerprints of the hands that packed it decades ago. You remember once hearing a quirky claim that certain tea merchants in the old days would subtly press their initials or symbols into the bricks, like a hidden signature. No one's proven it beyond doubt. Historians still argue whether those marks were branding, superstition, or just quirks of the pressing molds, but you like to imagine it's true, a little secret handshake across time. You chip off the leaves, letting them tumble into the pot, and fill it with fresh water. The first boil is brisk, rolling, and the scent rises almost instantly, earthy and strong, with a faint edge that promises depth when mixed with butter. You lean in, inhaling deeply. The butter sits waiting on the cutting board, its surface smooth except where your knife leaves thick, soft-edged slices. You drop them into the churn with a muted thunk, followed by the salt, just enough to bite without being brash. The tea follows, steaming, swirling as it meets the fat. You lower the churn's lid, grip the handle, and start the familiar work. There's a strange satisfaction in how your body knows this motion now, no thought needed. Up, twist, press, lift. The churn thuds lightly against the floor in a steady, heartbeat rhythm. Outside the walls, faint wind hums through the prayer flags. Inside, the sound is muffled, as though the room itself has decided to keep the world at bay for a while. A small group lingers near the hearth. One of them, a visiting trader, is telling a half-serious story about an ancient butter tea blend that supposedly included crushed pine nuts, passed down in one remote village. He swears he tasted it once. The others laugh, claiming that if it ever existed, it was probably an accident when a squirrel dropped something into the churn. You keep churning, the smell growing richer, the mixture thickening into that perfect consistency that clings to the ladle without sliding away too quickly. There's a kind of quiet authority in knowing exactly when to stop, no clock, no timer, just the feel of the resistance in your arms and the look of the foam along the surface. You pour the first bowls and carry them over. The trader reaches for his with both hands, testing the temperature with a cautious sip. He nods with a satisfied as though you've passed some unspoken test. As more bowls find their way into hands, the room begins to hum again, snippets of conversation, low laughter, and that contented sigh people make when warmth seeps into their chest. You take a bowl for yourself this time, settling onto the low bench. The first sip is like a small homecoming, the taste so familiar it feels older than memory. Through the window, you catch sight of a lone figure crossing the snow. They move slowly, shoulders hunched, and even from here you can feel the cold radiating off them. You set your bowl down, grab another from the stack, and fill it to the brim. By the time they push open the door, you're already holding it out. No words, just the exchange of tea for gratitude in the form of a faint, tired smile. You return to the churn, topping up bowls as they empty. The light outside continues to fade, the sky darkening at the edges. Soon the hearth will be the only real illumination in the room, and the tea will taste even better in that half-golden glow. The trader, now on his second bowl, leans over and asks if you've ever heard of the debate about the true origin of butter tea, whether it came from Tibetan plateau ingenuity or was adapted from something brought along old nomadic routes. You shrug, admitting that historians still argue about it. Personally, you think the best origin story is simply someone got cold and thought, why not put butter in it? Sometimes survival makes better recipes than any tradition. The last of the batch is gone before you realize it, and no one seems in a hurry to move. The outside world can wait. For now, everyone's attention is here, hands warm, stomachs full, and the gentle understanding that you'll be making more soon enough. You let the churn rest, leaning against it like an old friend, and breathe in the air heavy with steam and stories. The night begins to close in with that slow, unhurried authority mountains have. You can feel it seeping under the door, not in gusts but in steady, invisible waves, cold so subtle it doesn't shock, just wraps itself around your ankles and asks politely if it can stay. The fire's glow now feels like a private little sun, and your eyes keep flicking to it between tasks, as though it's quietly checking in on you. The churn stands empty again, which means it's time for another round. You've long since lost count of how many times you've repeated this ritual today, but that's the thing about repetition, it stops being a number and becomes a rhythm. In some ways, the making is more soothing than the drinking. From the corner shelf, you take down the small pouch of salt. Not the everyday coarse kind, but the finer, almost powdery grains reserved for late-night batches. They dissolve faster, blending into the tea like they've been waiting all their lives for this exact moment. Beside it, the butter, cut and resting under a thin cloth, waits in quiet obedience. You pour fresh water into the pot, drop in a measured heap of tea leaves, and let them swirl into the rising heat. The steam coils upward, brushing your face with its earthy breath. Somewhere in the back of your mind, a stray fact surfaces that in certain monasteries, late-night butter tea sessions were often accompanied by long scripture readings. The monks believed that the warmth kept them alert during those dense, hours-long recitations. Historians still argue whether it was the tea or sheer discipline that kept them awake. You're leaning toward the tea. A friend wanders in from outside, their cheeks flushed red from the cold. They hold a wooden prayer bead necklace in one hand, rolling it slowly as they settle onto a low stool. "Snow's starting," they murmur. You can almost hear it in their voice, the way snowfall makes sound feel different, softer, as though the world's been wrapped in layers of wool. The tea is ready for the churn, and you pour it in, watching the butter sink and then wobble back to the surface like shy little boats. You grip the handle and begin the churn song, thud, twist, thud, lift, a slow percussion that syncs with your breathing. The warmth seeps into your forearms, each stroke making the mixture creamier, silkier. In a quieter corner, two visitors are discussing an odd old tale about a Highland herder who supposedly brewed tea with yak butter during a thunderstorm, only to find the flavor transformed by the electrical spirit of the sky. You can't tell if they're quoting folklore or making it up on the spot, but you're tempted to file it away for the next time someone asks about the secret ingredient. The churn is perfect now. You pour the first steaming bowls, carrying them to where the firelight falls brightest. Your friend takes theirs, wrapping both hands around it and letting the steam touch their face before sipping. That first sound, the soft ah, might as well be a bell ringing in a quiet temple. Outside, the snow has begun to whisper against the roof, a sound so faint it's more felt than heard. You imagine it layering slowly, smoothing out the edges of every rock, every footprint, until the whole mountainside feels like it's been erased and redrawn in white. You serve another bowl to a young boy curled up near the hearth, his eyelids drooping even as he drinks. He probably won't finish it before sleep takes him, but that's fine. The tea will still be warm when he wakes. You take your own bowl this time, sitting back and letting the butter-rich taste fill your mouth. The salt lingers at the edges, just enough to keep it from being heavy. You sip slower than usual, trying to match the snow's pace. One of the older guests clears their throat and starts recounting how their grandmother used to brew tea in a pot lined with pine resin, swearing it added a mountain spirit flavor. Historians, predictably, still argue whether resin lining was a preservation technique or just one of those personal quirks that get mistaken for tradition. The fire pops, sending up a brief cascade of sparks that wink out before reaching the roof. Everyone's eyes follow them for a second before drifting back to their bowls. The quiet is the good kind, not empty, but full of shared contentment. You top up a few bowls and then set the churn aside for a longer rest. The snow's still falling, and you have the odd feeling that it's waiting for you to finish before it decides how deep it wants to be by morning. The night is young in its own slow-moving way, and you're in no rush. The tea will keep, the fire will burn, and the ritual will repeat again and again until the world outside is nothing but white and the inside is nothing but gold. The snow hasn't stopped. By now, it's taken on that hushed, persistent rhythm that suggests it could keep going all night without once checking in to see if you're okay with it. You crack the door open just wide enough to let in a breath of the outside, and the cold that rushes in is sharp enough to nip at your skin before retreating again. For a moment, you smell the snow. Yes, it really does have a smell, a mix of metal, air, and something almost like wet stone. Inside, the churn still leans where you left it, a faint sheen of butter clinging to its rim. You wipe it down slowly, not because it's a hard job, but because it's the kind of simple, circular motion that calms you. The pot on the fire hums softly. The tea inside isn't boiling yet, but it's on its way. You've been doing this long enough to know there's no rushing the leaf infusion stage. The leaves need time to open up, to share their essence with the water. A random historical tidbit pops into your mind. Centuries ago, caravans carrying tea to Tibet would travel overland from China, the journey taking months. By the time the tea arrived, it was often compressed into dark, brick-like slabs. Travelers would chip off pieces, boil them for hours, then churn with butter. Historians still argue whether the long transport enhanced the tea's flavor or simply made everyone grateful for anything hot. You check the butter supply, plenty left, wrapped in cloth that's just slightly damp from the kitchen's warmth. You take a block, the knife sinking into it with a quiet resistance, and you think about how butter making is its own ritual. Somewhere far from here, someone had to milk the yak, churn the cream, press it into shape. It's a chain of care that stretches from mountain pasture to your own hands. A gust rattles the shutters, and you glance toward the window. Outside, a pair of wandering dogs nose through the drifts, their tails curled like question marks. You wonder if they'll get a few scraps from the kitchen before they vanish into the white again. The tea is ready for the churn. You pour it in, adding butter and a pinch more salt than usual. Cold weather calls for a little extra. The churn's handle fits perfectly in your grip, and you start the steady work, the sound mixing with the occasional creak of the building's frame. You fall into that odd, comfortable trance where you're aware of everything yet not thinking too hard about any of it. From the far corner, someone pipes up with a story about an old hermit who claimed that butter tea could hold the soul in place during dreams. No one seems to know if he meant it literally or figuratively, and by the way the teller is grinning, you suspect even the hermit wasn't sure. The churn is done, and you pour the first round into thick-walled bowls. The surface gleams with a thin film of butter that swirls lazily when disturbed. You hand one to a man sitting cross-legged near the fire. He accepts it without a word, just a nod and a long sip. You take your own seat, your bowl cradled between your palms. The taste is deep tonight, salty, savory, faintly smoky from the leaves. You close your eyes for a moment, feeling it spread warmth through you like slow-moving sunlight. Outside, the snow muffles everything. Even the usual night sounds, dogs barking, wind scraping against the eaves, have faded into a softer, rounder version of themselves. You can almost imagine the whole village holding its breath. An older woman, wrapped in a shawl patterned with tiny embroidered mountains, begins humming a low, repetitive melody. It doesn't rise above the sound of the fire, but it threads through the room like a thin ribbon of color. The rhythm of it pairs with the occasional sip of tea, and you realize you've been matching your breathing to it without thinking. In this moment, there's nothing to prepare for, no next step to chase. Just the churn, the fire, the snow, and the tea, an unbroken loop that feels like it could go on forever without getting old. You tip back the last of your bowl, savoring the way the salt lingers just long enough to make you want more. You stand, stretch, and start preparing the next batch. Because here, tonight, enough tea isn't really a thing, it's just a pause before the next serving. The fire has burned down to a bed of embers now, glowing with that deep, almost hypnotic red that makes you feel both drowsy and alert at the same time. You feed it a few thin sticks, watching how the flames reappear in slow motion, licking up the wood as if they're testing the taste before committing. The kettle rests back on the stones, the tea leaves steeping in their second round. This is the part of the night when conversations either get very quiet or very strange. Someone in the far corner leans forward, elbows on knees, and tells you about a traveler they met once, a man who claimed he could tell the weather for the next 10 days just by smelling butter tea. You don't know whether to believe that, but the story isn't the point, the telling is. It's the way the words hang in the air, warm and curling like steam, giving everyone in the room something to lean into. Historians still argue whether Tibet's oral storytelling tradition evolved from necessity, no books, no printing presses, or whether it was simply a love for turning ordinary events into legends. You check the churn. It's still warm from earlier, and the handle carries a faint residue of salt. You wipe it down, partly out of habit and partly because it gives you something to do with your hands while the kettle does its slow work. The snow outside hasn't eased up. You can feel it through the air gaps in the shutters, a subtle change in the way the cold presses against the walls. At this altitude, storms can roll in and out like bored cats, unpredictable and a little mischievous. One moment the sky is clear, and the next, you're in a swirling cloud of ice. Somewhere in that snow, maybe miles away, a herder is huddled under a yak hair tent, sipping tea from a wooden cup that looks just like yours. The kettle starts its low hum, and you take it off the fire before it tips into a boil. Too hot, and the leaves go bitter. You add the butter, a generous scoop tonight, then a pinch of salt, swirling the mixture before pouring it into the churn. Churning is quieter now, your pace slow and even. You're not in a rush. In fact, you'd almost like this moment to last forever. The repetition lets your thoughts drift, and they land on a quirky fact you once read. In some parts of the Himalayas, butter tea isn't just for drinking, it's also used to grease wooden bowls so food won't stick, and even to smooth down hair before festivals. You picture yourself styling your hair with tea and decide you'd rather not test that one tonight. When the tea is ready, you pour it into the waiting bowls. The steam rises in thin, twisting lines, and the scent, salty, rich, faintly smoky, fills the air. You hand out the bowls, one by one, feeling the slight weight of each as it passes from your hands to someone else's. You keep one for yourself and sit back near the fire. The warmth seeps into your legs through the woven mat, and you let the soundscape of the room settle over you, the slurp of tea, the crackle of wood, the occasional sigh from someone leaning deeper into their blanket. Outside, the dogs have moved on, but their paw prints trail away into the whiteness like dotted lines on a map. You take another sip, the salt making your tongue tingle just enough to keep you present. In the lull, your eyes wander to the shelf in the corner, lined with mismatched bowls, carved spoons, and a few strange objects you can't quite identify. One looks like a tiny drum, another like a wooden horn. You make a mental note to ask about them later, knowing full well you'll probably forget, because in a place like this, curiosity is a slow-burning thing. You don't need all the answers right away. The older woman from earlier starts humming again, this time joined by a low male voice. The two sounds braid together, unhurried and steady, and you realize the room has unconsciously shifted to match their rhythm. You finish your tea slowly, not because you're avoiding the last sip, but because you're reluctant to let the moment end. You place your empty bowl on the floor beside you and watch the embers pulse in the hearth. Somewhere far away, beyond the snow, beyond the mountains, there are cities buzzing with light and noise. But here, in this small circle of heat and tea and breath, the world has narrowed down to exactly the right size. The night stretches on, and with it, the small rituals that keep you warm and content. The teapot has been moved slightly closer to the fire again, not because anyone urgently needs more, but because it feels wrong for it not to be there, like a stage with no actor. You lean against the wall, feeling the faint texture of wood beneath the wool of your shoulder wrap, and let your eyes follow the lazy drift of smoke curling toward the ceiling. Someone has pulled a basket closer to the fire, and inside, wrapped in cloth, are blocks of butter. They sit there like quiet treasure, glistening faintly in the dim light. You're told that in some families, the butter is molded into intricate designs before special occasions, little flowers, spirals, or animals pressed by hand. In winter, the shapes can last for days. In summer, they soften into something less recognizable but equally fragrant. Historians still argue whether these butter carvings began as a purely decorative gesture or as offerings meant to please local spirits. Either way, they're beautiful in their short-lived existence. You're invited to help prepare another batch, and though your fingers are comfortably warm inside your sleeves, you can't resist. You work the butter between your hands just enough to soften it, feeling its dense, creamy weight. Then you drop it into the churn, watching it settle like a sleeping creature before the salty tea joins it. The churn creaks softly as you start your rhythm again. This time, your strokes are matched by the quiet tapping of a wooden pestle nearby. Someone is crushing roasted barley for tomorrow's breakfast. The sound is steady and grounding, the kind of domestic noise that slips into your bones without you realizing. You glance outside. The snow has eased to a faint flutter, flakes drifting down like they've decided to take their time. The moon's glow filters through the curtain of frost on the window, casting faint patterns on the floor. Somewhere far off, a yak bell jingles, soft and irregular, like it's swinging gently in the wind. You take a break from churning to sip from the previous batch, which has cooled enough to drink in generous mouthfuls. The salt hits first, then the creamy depth of the butter, coating your mouth in a way that makes plain water seem almost shy in comparison. You've read that butter tea wasn't always made with tea leaves. Long before trade routes brought tea bricks from China, some highland communities used local herbs boiled into a broth with yak butter. It's one of those culinary shifts historians still debate over, whether tea replaced the herbs because of its taste, or because it traveled better in trade. The conversation in the room shifts to lighter topics, someone teasing another about snoring, someone else laughing about a time they forgot to salt the tea entirely and everyone politely pretended it was fine. The jokes are soft-edged, the kind that require no defense, only the shared understanding of long winters and many cups of tea. A child, small and bundled in layers that make them look like a walking quilt, wanders over to you. They hold out a small carved object, an animal, perhaps a yak or maybe a goat. The lines are simple enough to leave it to interpretation. You thank them and turn it over in your hands. The wood is smooth from being handled often, and there's a faint scent of butter, as if it's been tucked into a pocket during chores. When the next pot is ready, it's poured into the wide communal bowl, and everyone dips their cups in turn. You like this unspoken agreement, no rush, no fixed order, just the steady flow of sharing. In the modern world, you think this would be called informal hospitality, but here, it's simply life. The butter blocks have been wrapped back in their cloth and placed in the shadow of the wall, safe from the fire's heat. You watch them for a moment, realizing they're as much a symbol of comfort here as any blanket or hearth, literal reserves of warmth and sustenance. A faint wind picks up, rattling the wooden eaves. The sound blends with the fire's crackle, the low murmur of voices, and the occasional slosh from the churn. You realize you've fallen into a rhythm yourself, not just in churning, but in being here, in matching the pace of this quiet, layered life. And though you know the night will eventually slip away, taking with it the fire's glow and the warmth of the room, you find you're not counting the minutes. The tea in your bowl is enough for now, and so is the company. The fire has burned down to a mellow, ember-rich glow, the kind that seems to hum its own lullaby in the background. You're not cold, not even close, but you can feel the subtle temperature shift as the logs settle and sigh. The kettle's soft hiss has become a kind of white noise, and you're almost lulled into forgetting that tea making is still happening until a hand nudges your elbow and passes you a fresh, steaming cup. This one is richer than the last batch, darker in color, with a slightly stronger salt note. It catches you off guard, how just a small change in the ratio of butter to tea leaves can alter the entire personality of the drink. You take a slow sip, letting the steam fog your glasses, and the person beside you chuckles, sliding you a scrap of cloth to wipe them clear. As you drink, your eyes wander to the far corner of the room where a low, wooden chest sits. It's unassuming, but when your host opens it, the faint fragrance of tea bricks and dried herbs slips out. The bricks are wrapped in cloth and stacked like patient, square sentinels. One is unwrapped and set before you. It's heavy for its size, dense with pressed tea leaves. Mainstream history says these bricks were once used as currency in trade, their value determined by weight and quality. That makes sense. Holding one now, it feels like holding a day's wage in your palm. But there's a quirk to this collection. Nestled between the bricks is a small, knotted pouch filled with something that rattles faintly. Your host tips it out into your hand, smooth, oval stones, no bigger than your thumb. They're from a river far below the mountains, brought back by a trader. Some people here believe the stones can keep stored tea from going stale. Historians still argue whether that's a superstition born of coincidence or if there's some mineral effect no one has fully studied. Either way, the stones have clearly earned their place in the chest. While another batch of tea brews, you're drawn into helping break a brick. It's harder than it looks. You have to wedge a blunt knife into the seam and tap it just so, coaxing it apart without shattering it into dust. When the leaves finally give way, there's a faint snap, like opening a thick old book. The scent that rises is earthy, with a shadow of smoke, and you can't help leaning in to inhale again. Outside, the snow is quiet but relentless, filling the world with its muffled hush. You think about how, in places like this, tea-making isn't just about drinking, it's a way to pass the hours while storms seal the mountains. The act itself becomes part of the shelter. The tea leaves go into the pot, mingling with fresh water drawn from a large copper vessel near the wall. You notice the vessel's surface is engraved with faint designs, swirling patterns that catch the firelight when you move your head. Someone mentions that it's been in the family for generations, carried up here by an ancestor who walked from a valley hundreds of miles away. You can imagine that journey, the weight of the vessel slung over his shoulder, the stubborn determination to keep it safe. As the pot simmers, conversation meanders towards stories of past winters, how one year the snow was so deep that the path to the neighboring home had to be tunneled out by hand, and how in another year, butter supplies ran so low that tea was rationed to half cups for weeks. A young man jokes that if that happened now, he'd stage a rebellion, and the laughter that follows is as warm as the steam rising from the kettle. You take another sip of your tea and feel it spreading heat into your chest. It's easy to imagine that each cup here carries more than just calories. It carries small pieces of history, shaped by trade routes, weather patterns, and the habits of countless hands. And you find yourself wondering if you'll remember this exact taste years from now, the way a certain song or scent can teleport you back to a moment you didn't know you were memorizing. When the kettle sings a little louder, the butter is brought out again, unwrapped from its cloth like a gift. Its surface glistens faintly in the firelight, and you notice that the edges have softened just enough to yield to the spoon. You help measure it into the churn, and once again the room falls into that steady rhythm of plunge and twist, plunge and twist. The sound blends with the soft patter of snow against the window and the occasional pop from the fire. By the time the churn stops, the room smells faintly sweeter, the tea having absorbed the butter's richness completely. The first cup is ladled out for the elder in the room, who takes it with both hands, murmuring something you can't quite catch but recognize as a blessing. You take yours in turn, holding it close, and feel the warmth in your fingers before you even taste it. And once more, you're reminded, in this place, tea isn't rushed, it's allowed to live out its full, unhurried story in the pot, in the churn, and in the hands that pass it to you. The embers have dimmed to a deep, breathing orange, the kind that makes you want to curl deeper into your blanket. You're still perched on the low cushion, and the steam from your tea curls upward like it's trying to escape into the rafters. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and something nutty. The butter has left its gentle signature on the room, even when the cups are empty. Tonight, the tea feels thicker on your tongue, almost creamy. You swirl it in your mouth like a sommelier, trying to detect every note, earthy leaves, warm fat, and that undercurrent of salt that seems to demand you keep sipping. Your host notices you savoring it and nods approvingly. There's pride here, not arrogance, just the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows how to get something exactly right. In the corner, a wooden frame covered in stretched hide catches your eye. It's a drum, not for music, at least not the kind you dance to, but for ceremonies. You're told it's used during certain butter tea rituals, especially at the start of winter. Mainstream history records that in highland villages, tea drinking often intertwined with religious gatherings, where drums like this would mark the rhythm of prayers. The sound, low and steady, was said to mirror the heartbeat, grounding everyone in the moment. But then comes the quirk. Your host swears the drum has another purpose, scaring away kitchen spirits that might steal the tea's strength if left unbothered. The idea sounds playful, but there's a conviction behind their smile. Historians still argue whether such beliefs came from genuine superstition or were just clever ways to make kids help with chores. Either way, you're tempted to give the drum a try, just to see if the tea tastes different afterward. Someone is already setting up for another batch. The kettle is filled again, and the brick tea is shaved instead of broken this time, the leaves flaking into a neat pile. It's more delicate work, like whittling, and the rhythm of the knife on the brick becomes its own quiet percussion. Your eyes drift toward the window. The snow hasn't let up, and the night outside is so thick you can almost believe the whole world has been erased, leaving just this warm bubble of firelight and tea. You think about how, in your usual life, drinks are just something to grab between tasks. Here, tea is the task, the centerpiece, the reason for everyone to sit and stay. The churn is brought forward again, but this time they invite you to take the first turn. You grip the handle and push down, feeling the weight of the butter-water tea mixture push back. The resistance is oddly satisfying, like you're stirring not just liquid but the day's weariness right out of it. Around you, the others keep talking, stories of traders who once carried tea over impossible passes, of storms that trapped caravans for weeks. One man mentions an old route that's now half forgotten, a winding trail said to be haunted by tea ghosts who appear as friendly strangers offering warm cups. The catch? If you drink, you'll wander off the path and vanish into the snow. No one interrupts his tale to say it's nonsense. In fact, someone else adds that, in a way, the ghosts are just a warning to stay alert. You sip your tea and can't decide if that's comforting or not. The churn passes hands, the motion slow and steady, until the tea has turned the right shade of golden brown. Cups are filled again, and you notice a small plate of pale biscuits appear on the table. They're slightly dry, meant to be dipped into the tea. The first one you try soaks up the liquid like a sponge, dissolving almost instantly in your mouth. The flavor is simple, just flour and a little butter, but combined with the tea, it's perfect. Between sips, you hear a story about a year when the butter supply ran dangerously low, forcing families to improvise. Some used yak fat instead, functional, but, as everyone agrees, nowhere near as good. Others, in desperate weeks, drank the tea without any fat at all, just salt and leaves. That's apparently still done in some regions, though it's considered a bit of a last resort. You imagine it like drinking a shadow of the real thing, and silently thank the universe for the rich, full cups in front of you now. The fire is fed with another log, and the room brightens slightly. You notice the kettle's handle has been wrapped in layers of warm cloth, probably to protect hands from the heat, but also to give a better grip. It's frayed in places, and you wonder how many thousands of times it's been lifted over the years. You drain your cup slowly, letting the last sips linger. There's no rush here, no one tapping their foot or glancing at a clock. The tea session will last as long as the night does, and the night feels endless. Somewhere in the rafters, a faint creak makes you glance up. Just with settling, most likely, but you remember the kitchen spirits and the tea ghosts, and you can't help smiling into your cup. Whatever else is out there, right now, you're warm, full, and exactly where you're supposed to be. By now the snow outside has shifted from a heavy curtain to a finer mist of flakes, each one catching in the dim moonlight like powdered sugar shaken from the sky. You can't hear it falling, snow is sneaky like that, but you can feel its presence in the cooler air seeping in from the edges of the window frame. The warmth inside feels even more precious in contrast, like a soft quilt wrapped around your whole body. Your host has settled back onto the low cushion, a fresh kettle already beginning to hum over the fire. You've lost count of how many rounds of tea you've had, but it doesn't matter, the point was never the number. In this place, tea is measured in hours of conversation, in pauses filled with the crackle of wood and the slow pull of steam toward the ceiling. A new ritual begins. From a small carved box, they remove a handful of dried tea leaves, different from the brick you've been using. These are whole leaves, long and slightly twisted, a sign of finer quality. Mainstream historians note that in Tibetan households, brick tea was the workhorse of daily life, but loose-leaf varieties were often reserved for special occasions or honored guests. Apparently, tonight, you qualify. The leaves are tossed into the kettle without any measuring spoon, just the practiced handful of someone who knows exactly how much is right. You catch the faint scent almost immediately, greener, sharper, with a subtle floral note hiding under the smokiness. Then comes the quirky part, your host drops in a small, polished pebble. At your raised eyebrow, they explain that it's a tea stone, used for decades in their family. It supposedly keeps the tea honest, which you're told means preventing bitterness and helping the flavor settle. Whether it's chemistry or pure tradition, historians still argue whether such practices ever truly altered the brew, or if it was just a charming superstition. Either way, it's a detail you'll be telling people about when you get home, assuming you can explain it without sounding like you've gone slightly tea mad. While the tea simmers, someone produces a set of wooden dice from a leather pouch. The edges are worn, the numbers etched deep and darkened by years of handling. You're drawn into a simple game, half chance, half quick math, meant to pass time between brewing and serving. You lose your first round spectacularly, which earns you not ridicule, but a teasing suggestion that you should stir the tea as punishment. You accept, of course, since any excuse to handle the churn feels like participating in something much bigger than a game. The churn's handle is smooth against your palm, though it faintly warm from earlier use. This batch feels lighter, almost buoyant, as the mixture turns creamy. You can hear the soft slap of liquid against wood, a sound that's both rhythmic and random, like a heartbeat with an irregular, calming drift. When it's done, the cups are lined up again. This time, the tea's color is a lighter gold, and the taste is gentler, less earthy, more delicate. It still has the signature butter salt body, but now there's a faint sweetness on the back of your tongue, almost like hay in summer. You sip slower, letting each swallow coat your mouth before you breathe out. As you drink, the conversation shifts toward travel tales. A younger man recalls trekking with his uncle to trade butter and wool for tea bricks in the valleys below. He describes narrow paths carved into cliff faces, with nothing but clouds beneath you. His story takes a sudden turn when he claims they once encountered a yak standing perfectly still in the middle of the path, staring directly at them for what felt like hours. They eventually went around, but his uncle insisted the yak was a spirit guardian deciding whether to let them pass. You're about to ask more when someone else cuts in with a memory of a tea stall in Lhasa, where they swear the tea was brewed with a secret ingredient, apricot pit kernels ground into powder. This, they say, gave the tea a faint almond aroma. Historians still debate whether such additions were widespread or just regional experiments, but in this room, the idea is treated with respectful curiosity rather than skepticism. Your cup is refilled before you even notice it's empty. You lean back against the low wall, feeling the warmth seep into your bones. There's a moment where everyone just sits, not speaking, not moving much, just existing in the soft glow of the fire. The silence here isn't awkward, it's like an extra ingredient in the tea itself, a seasoning that makes the whole experience richer. After a while, the game resumes, but you find yourself watching instead of playing. You trace the grain of the wooden table with your fingertip, noticing little notches and stains. Maybe they're from meals long gone, or maybe they're just the marks of daily life. Either way, they feel like the fingerprints of time itself, holding all the stories this table has witnessed. The kettle hisses softly, and your host leans over to adjust it, adding a final handful of leaves. You can smell the difference instantly, stronger, bolder, like the tea is gathering itself for one last statement before the night deepens further. Somewhere outside, a dog barks once, then again, and then falls silent. The wind picks up faintly, making the wooden eaves groan. You wrap your fingers tighter around your cup, grateful for the anchor of heat it offers. And just like that, you realize you're not keeping track of time anymore. You're not checking the window to guess the hour, you're not wondering when this will end. You've slipped into the rhythm of the tea, the churn, the stories, and the shared silences. Outside, the snow may be endless, but in here, it's only the tea that matters. The night has now settled into its deepest shade, that strange blue-black where the outlines of the mountains blur into the sky. You wouldn't know it from inside, though. The fire still burns with a steady orange heart, and the air is thick with the mingled scent of butter, tea, and faint wood smoke. Your shoulders have relaxed without you noticing, and your voice, when you speak, comes out softer, like you're afraid to break something delicate. Your host is stirring another pot, this time with a slower, more deliberate motion, like they're coaxing something rather than mixing it. They explain, in the patient tone of someone repeating a story they've told many times, that this round is resting tea. Unlike the vigorous churned brew you've been drinking, resting tea is allowed to steep longer without agitation, letting the butter rise in a thin, glossy layer on top. Mainstream history notes that this style was common in monasteries, where tea was consumed in quiet contemplation rather than chatter. The quirky twist? A pinch of roasted barley flour, tsampa, is whisked in just before serving. Your host grins, saying it gives the tea shoulders to stand on. You can see what they mean. The powder thickens the drink slightly, making it cling to the cup's rim. Historians still argue whether this addition was born out of necessity during lean times or simply became an acquired taste. Either way, it feels like a hug you can drink. As the tea rests, your host gestures toward a stack of weathered cloth bundles in the corner. Curiosity gets the better of you, and you untie one to find hand-woven yak wool scarves, their patterns bold and geometric. You run your fingers over the dense weave, the fibers slightly oily from natural lanolin, and wonder how many winters each has already survived. One of the elders notices your interest and tells you about their grandmother, who could weave an entire scarf in a single night if a trader was leaving in the morning. That sounds almost mythical, but you believe them. Hands here seem to remember more than minds do. The tea is finally poured, each cup receiving a lazy stream of golden brown liquid with that faint barley scent curling upward. It's heavier than previous brews, almost meal-like, and you can feel it lining your stomach with a slow-burning warmth. Your host watches your first sip closely, and you nod, because the taste is, yes, exactly as grounding as promised. Conversation drifts toward winter festivals. Someone recalls the Losar celebration, the Tibetan New Year, when butter tea flows non-stop and people exchange rounds of toasts that can last well into the next day. There's laughter as they imitate the overly formal speeches made by uncles who clearly had one cup too many. You learn that butter tea isn't just a drink, it's a social glue, binding family, friends, and strangers together in these long, cold months. Then comes the stranger tale. An old man swears that during one Losar, a visiting monk blessed their tea churn, after which the tea supposedly never spoiled, no matter how long it sat. You're skeptical, but you file it away in that mental cabinet where you keep all the delightful, unprovable things people tell you on cold nights. Historians still debate the extent to which such stories are metaphor or memory, but here, in the fire's glow, they feel just as real as the cup in your hand. After another round, your host rises and steps outside briefly. You follow, partly to stretch your legs, partly because you're curious about the sound of wind rattling a string of something near the door. It turns out to be prayer flags, long, faded strips of cloth in blue, white, red, green, and yellow, each one fraying at the edges. The flags stir lazily, their printed mantras worn almost invisible. Your host explains that each flutter carries blessings into the air. You stand there for a moment, letting the icy breeze sting your cheeks, thinking about how far such blessings might travel. Back inside, the tea has cooled slightly but hasn't lost its body. You cradle the cup and feel your eyelids growing heavier. It's not just the hour, it's the cadence of this place, the way everything seems to move at the speed of steeping leaves. You've stepped into a timeline where urgency simply doesn't exist. Someone begins humming, a low, even note that vibrates faintly in your bones. It's not a song you recognize, but it feels older than the language you speak. The others join in, not in harmony exactly, but in a kind of layered hum that fills the room with a soft, human drone. You sip in time with it, each swallow matching the rise and fall of sound. By the time the humming fades, the fire has burned down to embers. Your host doesn't bother to add more wood. There's enough heat left to see you through the night. Outside, the snow has finally stopped, leaving the world muffled and still. You press your cup to your lips one last time for this round, tasting the faint grit of barley at the bottom, and think, you could live inside this moment forever. You wake, if you ever truly slept at all, to a shift in the room's rhythm. The embers are no longer glowing so much as whispering their last faint heat, but in the corner, your host is already busy with the morning's first kettle. There's something reverent about the way they move, like each step has been mapped in advance, the way they pour, the way they tilt their head to listen for the boil. You've seen enough of this process by now to know it isn't muscle memory alone, it's a kind of devotion disguised as routine. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's the same butter tea base you've been surrounded by for hours, but sharper now, fresher, almost impatient. Morning tea, your host explains with a half smile, is a different animal. It's brisk, like it knows you've got things to do, even if those things are just more sitting around in thick socks. Mainstream history records that nomads often drank their morning butter tea with a pinch more salt than usual, claiming it woke the blood. Then comes the curious bit. Your host shakes a small pouch over the steaming churn, adding something that looks suspiciously like ground ginger. You raise an eyebrow, and they laugh, explaining it's a local trick for warming the body faster in the bitterest months. You can't find that in any recipe book, they say, but it's the kind of wisdom passed down in winks and nods. Historians still argue whether spiced variants of butter tea were a regional flourish or a rare experiment quickly abandoned in favor of tradition. Either way, you decide it's worth finding out firsthand. Your first sip nearly startles you. It's sharper than last night's drinks, the ginger's quiet burn threading through the buttery richness. It's like someone tucked a small ember under your tongue. The heat spreads through your chest, and you can almost believe that this is enough to keep the frost at bay without even leaving the hearth. The conversation over morning tea is lighter, more teasing. Someone remarks that your scarf is on backward. Someone else insists that you drink faster, or the tea will walk away on its own. You take it all in stride, maybe because you're still waking up, or maybe because this easy ribbing feels like proof that you've been folded into their morning like another ingredient in the brew. Your host gestures for you to follow them outside while the others finish their cups. The air hits you like a wall, brilliant, bright, and cold enough to snap the moisture from your breath instantly. The snow that fell last night lies pristine except for a few yak tracks wandering across the yard. Beyond, the mountains stand like ancient sentinels, their peaks catching the first real light of day. You're reminded of a historical tidbit. Some early explorers, upon reaching these high plateaus, recorded that the sunrise here felt closer than anywhere else, as if the sky itself were leaning down to greet you. But your host hasn't brought you out here for the view. They're pointing toward a small wooden rack just outside the door. On it are rows of shallow bowls, each holding a thin sheet of what looks like butter, except the color is paler, almost creamy white. These, your host explains, are the day's ration portions, hardened overnight in the cold. The air here works like a freezer, and this method keeps the butter ready to drop straight into tea without constant handling. It's a practical thing, but the sight of them lined up in neat rows against the bright snow has a strange beauty to it. There's another small ritual before heading back in. Your host takes one bowl, lifts it to their forehead, and mutters a few words you don't catch. You mimic the gesture, feeling faintly foolish, but the moment your forehead touches the cold, firm butter, you understand, it's a morning offering, a quiet nod to the day ahead. Back inside, another pot is already simmering. This time, you're handed a small cloth pouch of your own, filled with tea leaves. Your host gestures toward the kettle, and without much instruction, you drop the leaves in. They sink, then swirl upward in slow spirals. You stand there watching them open, like paper flowers unfolding in hot water. It's hypnotic, and you almost forget that you're supposed to stir. There's chatter around you about market day in the nearby village. Apparently, once the tea is poured, a small party will set off with wool goods, dried yak cheese, and maybe even some extra butter for trade. You feel a tug of curiosity. What does a market at this altitude look like, but also a reluctance to leave the hearth? You're starting to suspect that butter tea has an invisible tether, one that makes you want to stay exactly where it's served. Before you can decide, your host presses a fresh cup into your hands. The steam curls into your face, and the scent, salt, butter, ginger, and that faintly smoky tea anchors you to the present. The room feels brighter now, sunlight pooling on the floorboards, and you can almost hear the mountains breathing outside. You take another sip, and this time you understand, morning butter tea isn't just about waking up, it's about rejoining the living world after the stillness of night. It's an invitation to step back into motion, even if the motion is slow. The trek to the village begins with boots crunching over snow, each step squeaking faintly like someone walking across fresh cornstarch. You've still got that slow-burn ginger heat from your second morning cup, and it's keeping your toes from staging a mutiny. The sky is wide and cloudless, the kind of blue that feels like it's been over-edited in a travel magazine. You glance back at the small house you left, a faint wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. It already looks like something you dreamed rather than something you left 10 minutes ago. Your host walks ahead, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle that smells faintly of dairy and wood smoke, probably the day's trade goods. You're told the market is about a 40-minute walk if you don't dawdle, which is a problem, because you are absolutely going to dawdle. Every turn in the snow-packed trail offers a new vista, ridge lines that look like they've been drawn with charcoal, frozen streams that glint like someone scattered a jar of sugar across the rocks. Somewhere along the way, your host points out a stone cairn stacked beside the path, each rock dusted with snow. They explain that travelers add a stone for safe passage, a practice so old that no one can pinpoint its exact origin. Mainstream historians agree the cairn tradition in Tibet predates Buddhism, probably tied to older animist rituals. You add your own rock to the pile, mostly because you're not taking any chances with mountain hospitality. Then comes a delightful curveball. Your host halts by a small wooden box nailed to a fence post. You peek inside expecting mail or maybe offerings, but no, it's tea leaves. Loose, dry, and in little cloth sachets. Apparently, locals along this route sometimes leave tea for strangers, especially in the colder months. It's not a formal postal service, but it is a lifeline for anyone caught without supplies. Historians still argue whether this sort of roadside generosity was a formalized trade system or just the byproduct of living somewhere where your neighbor might be 30 miles away. Either way, you can't help grinning at the thought of a mountain version of a vending machine, only everything is free. When the village finally appears, it's less like a single place and more like a scattered conversation of buildings, stone houses huddled in small clusters, prayer flags strung between them like lines of half-forgotten poetry. The market is an open area where traders have set up on blankets, wooden planks, or the back of yak carts. There's no loud shouting to draw customers, just the low hum of voices, a blend of bargaining and catching up on winter news. Your host steers you toward a stall selling tea leaves from lower altitudes, wrapped in pressed brick form. You've read about these before, compressed for transport, easy to stack like currency. In fact, mainstream records note that in certain periods of Tibetan history, these tea bricks were literally used as money. The seller breaks one brick in half to show you the dense layering of leaves, and it's oddly satisfying, like snapping a big chunk of chocolate. Next to the tea stall is a vendor offering chunks of jaggery, or raw sugar that seems wildly out of place in your mental image of butter tea. Your host admits, almost sheepishly, that some folks do sneak in a pinch when they're feeling decadent. You're tempted to try it yourself, if only to commit a tiny act of sweet heresy. The vendor insists you take a small sample, and the earthy sweetness melts slowly on your tongue, a deep contrast to the salted richness you've been drinking for days. The rest of the market is a parade of textures, coarse yak wool scarves, intricately woven belts, wooden tea churns with carved handles. You run your fingers along one churn and feel the grooves worn by decades of use. The seller claims it belonged to their grandmother, who swore the tea tasted better when churned with her lucky arm. Quirky? Yes. Scientific? Almost certainly not. But part of you wants to believe it anyway. There's food too, small fried pastries dusted with flour, dried cheese cubes so hard you could probably use them as marbles, and steaming bowls of noodle soup being eaten on low stools by people whose cheeks are pink from the cold. The smell of broth mixes with the faint tang of drying yak hides in the background, and it's oddly comforting. At one point, your host disappears into the crowd and returns with a small, lidded jar wrapped in cloth. They tap it knowingly. It's butter from a family they trust, just right for tea, they say. The way they cradle it, you'd think it was a jar of gold coins. You realize this is the market's quiet truth. Yes, people come here for goods and news, but the underlying heartbeat is still tea. Everything you see, the leaves, the churns, the butter, the salt, could find its way into a cup before sunset. By the time you head back toward the house, your arms are loaded with small purchases you swore you wouldn't make. The path feels shorter now, partly because you're walking with others from the village, and partly because the thought of that afternoon's tea is tugging you forward. Halfway home, your host points to a ridge above the trail, where a herd of yaks is grazing against the snow. They explain that in the warmer months, these same animals carry bricks of tea up from the valleys, following routes that have been in use for centuries. Some scholars argue about how much those trade paths shaped not just the tea culture, but the entire rhythm of highland life. You picture caravans winding their way through the mountains, bells clanging softly, carrying the future in brick form. By the time the house comes into view, the sky is already shifting toward late afternoon gold. Inside, the hearth is being coaxed back into life, the churn is waiting, and there's a faint, buttery scent in the air, like the morning never really ended, it just wandered off to make room for the day's adventures. By the time the door swings shut behind you, the cold is a memory replaced by a rising wall of heat from the hearth. You shed your outer layers in slow succession, hat, gloves, the thick jacket that still holds the crisp scent of the village air. Your host sets the cloth-wrapped butter jar down on a low table as if returning a small relic to its shrine. The room feels more alive than it did in the morning. Someone else has arrived, a neighbor, judging by the easy greetings and the way they help themselves to a seat without ceremony. Their cheeks are flushed from the walk, and they carry a small pouch that jingles faintly when set down. From the smell, you can tell it's filled with tea leaves. The afternoon brewing begins without a word, but with a slightly different rhythm than the morning. There's no hurry, this is social tea, not survival tea. The kettle is set over the flames, the butter jar is unwrapped with a bit of reverence, and the churn is pulled closer. Your host scoops leaves from the neighbor's pouch into the pot, and the aroma starts building, deeper, richer than what you had earlier, almost chocolatey in the way it clings to the air. While the water boils, the three of you settle into an easy conversation. The neighbor mentions the market gossip. A trader from a valley 2 days away arrived with unusually fresh leaves, which is why they bought some. This sparks a discussion about trade routes, and your host explains that even today, some villages still rely on seasonal caravans to bring in their tea supplies. Historians note that for centuries, these caravans followed almost ritualized schedules, timing their arrivals with festivals or the start of the colder months, ensuring that no household faced winter without tea. When the leaves have steeped long enough, the mixture is poured into the churn along with water from a second pot, chunks of the fresh butter, and a careful pinch of salt. The churning begins, the wooden handle sliding up and down in its worn grooves with a sound like muted applause. You're offered a turn, and this time you accept. The motion is oddly satisfying, up, down, twist, like coaxing the tea into becoming itself. Your host watches with an approving smile and tells you a story. Once, in the early 1900s, a visiting European diplomat was so taken with the drink that he tried to replicate it at home using cow's milk butter and black tea from India. It wasn't the same, your host says with a chuckle, but he told everyone in London that Tibetans drink salty cocoa. You make a mental note that history is as much about mistranslation as it is about facts. When the tea is finally poured into bowls, it's creamier than anything you've had so far, with a depth that seems to expand in your mouth. The butter is softer, fresher, it blends so seamlessly with the tea that you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. The neighbor notices your silence and grins knowingly. This, they say, is what keeps us alive in winter. Not just the warmth, but this, they gesture to the space between you all, the shared air, the easy company. There's food, 2 small bowls of tsampa, the roasted barley flour that you've seen folded into tea in the mornings. You're shown how to sprinkle a little into your bowl, stir it in gently, and then scoop out the thickened drink with your fingers. The texture is like warm porridge, but the flavor carries that familiar salty buttery heartbeat. In historical records, tsampa is often described as the other half of tea culture in Tibet, inseparable from the drink, and just as essential. The conversation drifts to weather, then to festivals. You learn that during Losar, the Tibetan New Year, the tea isn't churned in the usual way, it's whisked to a froth and served with special snacks. Some families even add a pinch of sugar during the holiday, a sweet rebellion against the everyday recipe. Your host winks at you as if to say, maybe we'll do that for you tomorrow. As the light fades, someone adds more fuel to the fire, and the kettle is set back on its hook. You realize the tea here doesn't have a beginning or an end, it's a constant, a tide that rises and falls with the day. The bowl in your hands is warm, your shoulders are relaxed, and outside, the cold is thickening, but it no longer feels like something to fear. In that moment, you understand what historians can't quite pin down in their archives. Butter tea isn't just a drink, or even a tradition, it's an ecosystem. The leaves, the butter, the churn, the bowls, the conversation, the weather, the very architecture of the house, all of it is designed to sustain life in this high, thin world. And sitting here, you're no longer just an observer. You're part of the circle. The night air presses in on the little house like a cool, breathing blanket, and you find yourself pulling your borrowed shawl tighter as your host begins the gentle choreography of preparing the tea for evening guests. You didn't realize there would be more people coming, though, in hindsight, the way the kettle has been kept half full all afternoon should have been a clue. The first knock is soft but confident. A tall woman steps in, shaking frost from her sleeves, and behind her a younger man follows, his arms loaded with something wrapped in cloth. They greet your host with warm laughter, a quick clasp of hands, and a few teasing remarks that you don't understand, though the tone tells you they're affectionate. Whatever's in the cloth parcel is placed by the fire, turns out it's more butter, glistening pale gold in the flicker of the flames. The kettle hums louder now, and your host adds more tea leaves, letting them swim lazily in the rolling boil before ladling the liquid into the churn. The new butter is unwrapped, and the aroma is richer than anything you've smelled so far, something between cream and fresh grass. You watch as the churn's wooden handle rises and falls, the motion unhurried but sure, as if every stroke adds a little more warmth to the room. The woman settles near you and begins telling a story in a voice like worn silk. Your host translates. It's about an ancestor of hers who was a tea maker for a monastery in the 1700s. Back then, tea wasn't just a drink, it was part of ritual offerings. The monks would churn it in tall, ornate vessels before pouring it into small butter lamps as both sustenance and symbolic light. Historians still argue whether this was more spiritual or practical, your host adds with a shrug, but here, they're often the same thing. As the story winds down, bowls are passed around, and you're struck by the casual elegance of the serving. There's no clinking porcelain, no thin handles, just the warm heft of wooden bowls that fit into your palms as though they'd been made for your hands. The tea is smooth, salty, almost sweet in the aftertaste, and you notice that each person drinks with small pauses, letting the heat linger in the throat before the next sip. The younger man unwraps another gift, a small bundle of dried herbs, their fragrance sharp and minty. He explains, through your host, that these are added to tea in the late evenings during certain times of year, believed to aid digestion and ease the mind into rest. You can't help but think it's the Tibetan version of chamomile, except it tastes a bit like you're sipping a mountain breeze. In between sips, laughter rises and falls like the wind outside. There are jokes about someone's stubborn yak, a friendly debate about whether this year's butter is as good as last year's, and a mock-serious argument over which valley makes the best tea leaves. Apparently, there's no definitive answer, just a long-standing agreement to keep disagreeing. You find yourself reflecting on how tea here is never a solitary act. Even when made alone, it's made with someone in mind, family, neighbors, a guest who might arrive unexpectedly. In many rural Tibetan communities, Hospitality is measured not by the size of your home or the fineness of your dishes, but by whether you can offer tea at any time of day. The butter jar, the churn, and the kettle are like the holy trinity of readiness. One of the guests tells a quirky local tale. A traveler once came through a nearby village claiming to be able to tell a person's fortune by the sound of their churn. He would listen intently as the tea was mixed, then declare whether the coming year would bring rain, snow, or marriage. It's unclear whether anyone took him seriously, but apparently, people kept inviting him in for tea just to hear what he'd say. The evening deepens, and the kettle's song becomes part of the room's heartbeat. Another round of tea is poured, and this time your host stirs in a touch more butter for you, explaining that it'll keep you warmer through the night. The texture is silkier, heavier, comfort you can drink. You lean back against the low wall, listening to the murmur of conversation in a language that feels more like music than speech. You think about how, in much of the world, tea is considered a momentary break, a quick pause before returning to whatever comes next. Here, it's the main event. It's not just fuel for the body, it's fuel for the bond between people. The tea isn't a prop for conversation, it is the conversation, steeped in history, stirred by tradition, and served with quiet joy. By the time the last bowls are drained, the fire is glowing low, casting amber light over everyone's faces. The guests stand, exchange warm farewells, and step out into the crisp darkness, carrying the lingering warmth of the evening with them. Your host tidies the churn, wraps the butter again, and sets the kettle back over the embers so the water will be ready for morning. In the silence that follows, you can still feel the echo of the gathering, not just in the tea that warms your belly, but in the way your shoulders have loosened, your breathing slowed. You've been drawn a little deeper into this world, and the night feels friendlier for it. You wake before the sun, but the house is already awake. Not in a noisy, clattering kind of way, more like the slow, steady exhale of someone stretching into the day. The fire is being coaxed back to life, a faint orange heartbeat under a layer of pale ash, and the kettle has resumed its soft, rising murmur. You pull the shawl around your shoulders, the woven fibers still holding the faint scent of smoke and butter. Your host nods at you with a small smile that somehow communicates good morning without a single word. There's no rush here, but there's also no hesitation. Everything in this place begins with tea. The kettle is lifted, and steam rolls over the edges like low clouds spilling into a valley. The butter churn stands ready, its wooden lid polished from countless mornings. Your host moves with the kind of efficiency that only comes from decades of repetition. Scoop the tea into the churn, add yesterday's butter, now softened just enough by the hearth, and begin the up and down rhythm. The sound is hypnotic, thwup, 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 each plunge of the handle like a heartbeat keeping pace with the day's slow unfurling. As the churn works its alchemy, your host gestures toward the small window. Outside, the horizon is still dim, but the first blush of morning is creeping up from behind the mountains. This is the hour, you're told, when herds are checked and water is fetched. A neighbor passes by with a bundle of firewood, and you catch the quick flash of teeth and a smile before he disappears into the thin air of dawn. This is also when the first visitors sometimes arrive, not for a chat, but for what your host calls silent tea. You're about to ask what that means when, as if on cue, there's a knock. A man in his 50s steps inside, bows slightly, and sits without a word. Your host ladles tea into his bowl, and he drinks slowly, eyes closed, the steam curling against his cheeks. No one speaks. The only sounds are the crackle of the fire, the hum of the kettle, and the soft swallowing. It's not awkward, it's meditative. You start to realize this isn't a lack of conversation, it's a different kind of dialogue, one where the tea itself is the language. When the man finishes, he nods once, sets down the bowl, and leaves with a small bow. That's it. The ritual is over, yet you feel oddly refreshed, like you just watched a silent movie that somehow told you everything you needed to know. Your host explains, with a shrug, that silent tea is an old tradition in some parts of Tibet, shared most often in the early morning. Some say it's about starting the day in peace. Others claim it's a way of honoring the drink itself, letting its warmth and sustenance speak without interruption. Historians still argue whether it began as a spiritual practice or just a practical way to avoid talking before sunrise, your host says, handing you a steaming bowl. You take your first sip of the day, and the saltiness hits differently now, sharp and bracing at first, then mellow and almost sweet as the butter coats your tongue. You can see how, in this cold and thin air, a drink like this would be less of a luxury and more of a survival tool. The quirky part? You remember reading once that in some Himalayan trade caravans, butter tea was carried in skin bags and actually became more flavorful after sloshing around for days. The constant shaking churned it further, creating a richer blend. In other words, nomadic butter tea smoothies. By the time the sun clears the ridge, your host has made a second pot. This one is for the family members who drift in from their morning chores, 2 children with rosy cheeks, an older woman with a basket of herbs, and a wiry man whose boots are coated in frost. Each greets the tea before greeting anyone else, wrapping their hands around the bowls as if to anchor themselves to the morning. The conversation this time is lively, updates about livestock, news from a neighboring village, the small triumph of finding a misplaced tool. The air inside the house is thick with warmth, not just from the fire but from the shared energy of people beginning their day together. You realize that in this household, butter tea isn't just the first drink of the day, it's the first meeting of the day. There's a moment when your host leans toward you and says, "You'll see, in winter, this is even more important." Sometimes the snow is so deep, tea is the only visitor we get. You imagine the walls holding in the scent of smoke and dairy while the wind outside buries the path to the door, and it makes perfect sense, tea as both sustenance and companionship. By mid-morning, the kettle is back over the fire, and you notice there's always more water heating than seems necessary. Your host catches your glance and smirks. Tea is like a door here, it must always be ready to open. You sip your last mouthful and feel the butter coat your throat against the sharp air that awaits outside. The day is just beginning, but you're already thinking about the next time that kettle sings. You step outside, bowl still warming your hands, and the air snaps at your face with a crispness that makes your eyes water. The village is stirring in layers, first the quiet footfalls of early risers, then the low murmur of voices, and finally the occasional clang of metal against metal as tools are ready for the day. Above it all, the mountains loom in that calm, immovable way that makes you feel both tiny and somehow anchored. Your host walks beside you, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle. She doesn't tell you what's inside, she just smiles, the kind of smile that means you'll see soon enough. You pass a few houses, each with a thin ribbon of smoke curling upward, and then you notice the scent, rich, savory, undeniably buttery, seeping out of one doorway. Inside, another kettle is singing. It turns out the bundle contains small offerings, a jar of yak butter, a handful of dried tea leaves, and something wrapped in paper that smells faintly of juniper. You watch as your host presents them to the woman of the house, who accepts with both hands and a murmured blessing. In return, she gestures for you both to sit, and you do, knees tucked close to avoid the low table. This is the part you hadn't expected, visiting other butter tea makers, not just to drink their tea, but to trade ingredients, swap stories, and check in. The tea served here is subtly different, slightly less salty, with a faint smokiness that clings to the back of your tongue. Your host sips, nods approvingly, and then launches into a discussion about firewood types. You try to keep up, but all you catch is that certain woods give off a resinous smoke that can actually infuse the tea during brewing. One historical tidbit slips into the conversation. In older times, before trade routes brought brick tea in from China, families here brewed with wild leaves and roots from the hills. The flavor was earthier, and some claimed it had medicinal qualities. Historians still argue whether that was actually healthier or just nostalgia talking, the woman says with a grin. The talk shifts to weather, specifically, how much snow the high pass will get this season, and you learn that tea plays a strategic role here too. In deep winter, gatherings over tea become opportunities to share survival tips, report road conditions, and warn of wolf sightings. The quirky part? There's a superstition that if you spill butter tea on your clothes in winter, it will keep you warmer. You glance down at your own lap and wonder if that's just a clever way to make people feel better about being clumsy. After an hour, the bowls are drained, and you're on the move again. This time, the path leads to the edge of the village, where a small open space serves as the market square. It's not bustling in the big city sense, but for a place this remote, the energy is palpable. You hear the hiss of steam from a portable kettle, see steam clouds hovering over small makeshift stalls, and realize butter tea is as much a part of commerce as it is of home life. Your host introduces you to a man selling tea bricks stacked like small, dark books. He picks one up, knocks it against the table to show its solidity, and explains how travelers used to measure distance by how many tea bricks they'd gone through. It's the kind of fact that sounds like an exaggeration, but here, surrounded by people who still count winter supplies in months rather than days, it feels perfectly plausible. You take a break by one of the steaming kettles, watching as a young woman whisks tea in a churn faster than you thought human arms could move. Her method is brisk, efficient, less meditative than your host's, but still mesmerizing. When she hands you a bowl, you notice the butter here is lighter in color, almost golden, and the taste has a bright, grassy note. She explains it's from yaks grazing on a particular slope where wildflowers grow thick in summer. You didn't think butter could taste like sunshine, but here you are, proven wrong. The morning stretches into midday, and with it comes the sense that you've only just scratched the surface of this web of relationships woven around tea. It's not just about drinking, it's about showing up, exchanging warmth in both the literal and social sense, and keeping a quiet but constant pulse running through the village. As you head back toward your host's house, the wind picks up, carrying with it the scent of juniper from someone's hearth. The bundle she left with is lighter now, but there's a new weight in her other hand, a wrapped package of tea bricks from the market. For the week, she says, but you get the feeling it's also for whoever might come knocking unexpectedly. Inside again, the kettle is refilled without a word. This, you realize, is the unspoken rule of the butter tea maker. The pot is never truly empty, and neither is the welcome. The wind hasn't fully died down when you hear the rhythmic sound, thwack, 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 coming from somewhere beyond the courtyard. You follow it, passing the familiar kettle's gentle hum, until you find your host kneeling by a low wooden bench, a sturdy stone mortar in front of her. She's pounding something in a slow, deliberate motion, the kind of pace that tells you she's not racing the clock but coaxing the right texture from whatever's inside. It turns out she's working with roasted barley flour, tsampa, the other indispensable partner to butter tea in these mountains. You lean in to watch as she scoops a ladle of steaming tea into a small wooden bowl, adds a generous pinch of the flour, and then works it into a doughy lump with her fingertips. She presses the mixture into a neat ball and hands it to you, as if to say, "Go ahead." You bite into it cautiously, and the warmth seeps instantly into your cheeks and belly. It's buttery, nutty, and just the tiniest bit sweet in a way that makes you want another right away. Here, the two, tea and tsampa, are inseparable. One warms you from the inside, the other gives you fuel to keep going through thin air and long distances. Your host tells you that in the past, travelers would take a pouch of tsampa and a flask of butter tea instead of carrying whole meals. Historians still argue whether that was because it was the best survival food or just the easiest to carry, she says with a shrug. Either way, it worked. While she works, she mentions a little quirk that catches your attention. Some families keep a separate, smaller churn just for making the first bowl of tea each morning. It's a sort of private ritual, a way to wake the tea before brewing the day's larger pot. You imagine the quiet moment of sipping that first concentrated bowl, as the rest of the household still sleeps, the fire just catching hold, and the mountains outside still wearing the last of the night's darkness. Once the tsampa balls are ready, you both wrap a few in cloth for later and set out again. This time, the path takes you down toward the river, where prayer flags whip in the wind like rows of fluttering tongues telling the air their secrets. Beside the river, a group of elders sit on low stools, sipping tea from mismatched bowls. They wave you over, and you notice each one has a small pouch hanging from their belt. These pouches, you learn, carry personal tea bowls. Some are carved from wood, others shaped from metal with intricate engravings. The idea is simple but charming. Wherever you go, you're ready to accept tea without needing someone else's cup. There's something deeply personal about it, like carrying your own musical instrument everywhere just in case the moment calls for a song. The conversation here drifts into storytelling territory. One man tells of a winter so brutal that the river froze solid enough to walk across, but the tea never stopped flowing in the village. Even the axe got bowls, he claims, and though you suspect some exaggeration, you also notice nobody is laughing, they just nod knowingly. At one point, a woman pulls from her pouch not just her bowl, but a tiny wooden spoon with a handle worn smooth from decades of use. She dips it into her tea and offers you a taste, not because you don't have your own bowl, but because, as she says, you can't know a person until you've sipped from their spoon. It's such a tender, oddly poetic thought that you find yourself memorizing the exact cadence of her words. After the gathering, your host leads you up a narrow path along the riverbank to a small flat stone area. She sets down the tsampa and tea bundle, pours 2 bowls, and simply sits in silence. The only sounds are the rush of water below, the occasional call of a raven overhead, and the muffled crunch of your boots shifting on the gravel. You sip slowly, letting the heat and salt anchor you in the moment. A quirky fact emerges here too. In some villages, people will add a pinch of ground dried cheese to their tea for an extra protein boost. The result is richer, slightly tangy, and, according to your host, like drinking your lunch. You make a mental note to try it, though maybe not right now, since your belly is already comfortably heavy with tsampa. On the walk back, the sun dips lower, turning the river into a ribbon of molten gold. You pass more prayer flags, their colors faded from years of wind and weather, and it strikes you how much they resemble the tea itself. Both are offerings to something bigger, both are acts repeated so often they've become woven into the rhythm of daily life. By the time you're back in the courtyard, the kettle is sighing again, ready for another round. You help yourself to a bowl without being asked, a small but satisfying sign that you've begun to move from guest to participant. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you realize that tea here isn't just a drink or even a ritual, it's a portable hearth, a way of carrying home with you no matter how far you walk. And that's a kind of magic you can taste in every sip. You wake the next morning to the faint hiss of steam, the muffled thud of a wooden lid being set down, and the unmistakable smell of butter just beginning to melt into hot, frothy tea. The room is still dim, though the horizon outside the small window has begun to glow faintly blue. Somewhere a rooster half-heartedly crows, as if it knows that the sun hasn't fully made up its mind yet. You pull on your coat and step into the kitchen area, where your host is already moving with that measured efficiency you've come to recognize, a graceful mix of muscle memory and quiet intention. The kettle is on, the churn is waiting, and a neat row of bowls sits ready. You can tell this is the first batch of the day, and the air has that faint crispness of unbroken morning. She pours the tea into the churn and gives you the handle, nodding toward it like a coach handing over the ball before a decisive play. You grip it, start pumping, and feel the resistance of the tea and butter working against each other. It's thicker in the morning, almost reluctant to blend, until suddenly it loosens, softens, and you know you've crossed the invisible line where it becomes something else entirely. When you pour it out into the first bowl, you notice it's a little more golden than yesterday's later batches, with a sheen that catches the light like polished wood. You take a sip, and there's a richness that feels almost ceremonial. It's then your host mentions something you didn't know. In some households, the very first bowl of tea each morning is offered, not drunk, set aside for the household shrine or placed on a windowsill as a greeting to the spirits of the land. She explains that it's both a gesture of gratitude and a way of asking for protection over the day's work. Historians still argue whether this practice comes from early Buddhist influence or from older, pre-Buddhist traditions, she says, shrugging as she tops off your bowl. Either way, it survived centuries intact, and it feels like the kind of small, private act that shapes the rhythm of life more than the big events ever do. After the first round is finished, you both bundle up and step outside, following a narrow trail behind the house. The ground crunches under your boots, a mixture of frost and fine gravel. The air is so clear it's almost sharp, and every sound carries farther than you expect. You pass a small herd of yaks grazing in a flat patch of grass, their breath steaming in the cold. One lifts its head to look at you, chewing slowly, as if to say you're up early. You come to a low, square building with a simple wooden door, and when your host pushes it open, the smell of toasted grain and faint smoke rushes out to meet you. Inside, it's dim but warm, lit by a single oil lamp. An elderly man sits on a stool, stirring a pot over a sunken hearth. This is the village miller, and the pot holds freshly roasted barley. He tips a handful into your palm, still warm, and encourages you to taste. It's nutty, with a faint sweetness that makes you think of chestnuts. Here's a quirky bit your host shares. Some people claim they can tell the exact village a batch of tsampa comes from just by the aroma of the roasted barley. It sounds impossible, but as you breathe in the grain scent, you realize that maybe, just maybe, there's something to it. You watch as the roasted barley is ground by a small, hand-turned mill, the flour falling into a cloth sack in a soft, steady stream. The sound is almost hypnotic, like a sand timer spilling its measure in slow motion. The miller talks about how, in the past, entire families would take turns at the grind, singing work songs to keep time. Now, he says, we have fewer singers, but the flour still comes out the same. With a fresh sack of tsampa tied to her shoulder, your host leads you back toward the village. On the way, you pass a cluster of low stone walls marking what she calls the tea place. It's not an official tea house, just a sheltered space where anyone can stop, sit, and share a bowl with whoever else happens to be there. There are already 3 people sitting inside, passing a single wooden churn between them. They welcome you with quiet smiles, and someone hands you a bowl without asking your name. No small talk, no formalities, just the sound of tea being poured and the occasional murmur of appreciation. One man there tells a story about a blizzard years ago when travelers were trapped on the mountain pass for 3 days. We had no firewood left, so we burned yak dung to keep the kettle going, he says. The tea tasted different, but nobody complained. You laugh, but he insists the flavor was smokier, almost elegant. The tea here is served with a twist, literally. After pouring, they sprinkle a ribbon of melted butter across the surface, which swirls into patterns like tiny galaxies. It's purely aesthetic, but somehow the sight of it makes the drink feel more precious, like a little celebration in a bowl. When you finally stand to leave, the group waves you off with the easy warmth of people who don't need to know your history to treat you like you belong. The path back to your host's home is already familiar, but the tea in your stomach makes the steps feel lighter, the air less sharp. Back in the kitchen, she unties the sack of sampa and pours a little into a jar, then sets the rest in the corner, ready for the days ahead. You realize that the cycle here is constant: water, fire, tea, grain, and that you've been caught up in it without even noticing. And as you pour yourself another bowl, you also realize you wouldn't mind staying caught for a while longer. The day shifts from quiet morning to a more lively hum as the sun climbs higher, melting the last of the frost on the rooftops. A thin stream of smoke curls upward from nearly every chimney in the village, each one marking another household's tea hour in progress. From somewhere nearby comes the soft, rhythmic thump of a hand loom at work, and the scent of wool dye drifting faintly in the air, earthy, herbal, and slightly metallic. Your host decides it's a good day to visit her aunt, who lives a short walk away across a shallow stream. You take the narrow wooden footbridge, its planks creaking in protest under your boots, and step into a yard alive with the shuffle and snort of several goats. A tiny black puppy darts between their legs, clearly convinced it's one of them. Inside, the aunt's home is arranged around a central stove that's more ornate than the one you've seen, painted in red and gold floral patterns, with a line of little brass cups and butter lamps neatly placed along the top. A kettle already sits on the heat, and the aunt wastes no time in pulling out her churn. This one is different, made from gleaming copper, polished to a warm glow. She works the churn with practiced speed, humming under her breath. Her voice rises and falls in a way that almost syncs with the rhythm of the handle, and you suspect the tune is one of those old songs meant to make work go faster without the singer realizing it. While the tea brews, she pulls around, flat bread from a clay oven built into the wall. It's slightly blistered, with crisp edges and a soft, chewy center. She tears off a piece and shows you how to dip it into the tea before eating. The bread soaks up the buttery richness instantly, turning each bite into something halfway between soup and pastry. Conversation turns to an annual tea festival held in a neighboring valley, which she says is part competition, part celebration. Everyone claims their butter is the creamiest, their salt the purest, their churn the smoothest, she says with a knowing smile. Apparently, there are judges who taste each batch, but the real fun is in the performances, song duels, dance contests, even humorous storytelling sessions about tea mishaps. One story she recalls involves a man who accidentally made his tea with cheese brine instead of water, a mistake so notorious it earned him the affectionate nickname Brine Tea Uncle for the rest of his life. When the tea is ready, she serves it in delicate porcelain cups rather than the sturdy wooden bowls you've grown used to. The difference is striking. Somehow the same drink feels lighter, more refined, though no less filling. You ask if this is a special occasion choice, and she nods. Visitors get porcelain, she says, because they take the taste home in memory. After 2 cups, she pulls out a small jar of something thick and golden. At first you think it's honey, but the scent is faintly floral and unlike anything you've smelled before. She stirs a spoonful into your tea, and the flavor changes entirely, still buttery, still savory, but now layered with a gentle sweetness that reminds you of summer meadows. She explains that it's wildflower syrup, made in small quantities when the mountain blooms are at their peak. Too much would ruin the tea, she warns, but just a little makes you feel lucky. You linger longer than intended, enjoying the easy warmth of the conversation, the way her stories flow between personal memories and village history without pause. Every so often, she gets up to tend the stove, adding small pieces of dried yak dung to keep the heat steady. The smell is faint and not unpleasant, more like warm earth than anything smoky. When you finally leave, she sends you off with a cloth bundle of bread and a small pouch of wildflower syrup. For your next tea, she says. Outside, The puppy has collapsed in the sun, one ear twitching as it dreaming of a heroic goat-herding adventure. The walk back is unhurried, the stream now sparkling under full daylight. You notice that the village has subtly shifted, children are playing in the open square, a man is repairing a roof beam, and somewhere a radio crackles faintly with what might be a folk song. Back at your host's home, you set the gifts on the table and prepare the kettle again, eager to see if you can recreate the ants' tea with syrup. As the butter melts and the steam rises, you think about how each home has its own subtle way of making the same drink, different churns, different hands, different stories woven into the flavor. And you start to wonder, if you stayed long enough to learn them all, would you eventually taste the whole village in a single sip? The next morning, the village is quieter than usual. A thin fog clings low to the ground, giving the world a soft, dreamlike blur. Your breath leaves little clouds in front of you as you step outside, kettle in hand, and head toward the small communal field at the edge of the settlement. Your host explains that this is where the villagers sometimes gather to share tea in the open air, especially when the weather isn't too bitter, and there's an excuse to exchange news. Today's gathering is modest, half a dozen neighbors, a few squat stools, and 3 portable stoves already puffing out warm, fragrant steam. You're invited to sit with an older man who introduces himself as Dorj. His voice is gravelly but kind, and his hands look like they've known a lifetime of tools and rope. He pours you a cup from his kettle, and you notice his tea is noticeably darker than usual. Extra leaves, he says with a wink. Keeps you awake longer. Good for long stories. And long stories he delivers, tales of his youth herding yaks far from the village, of sleeping under stars so bright you could almost read by them. At one point, he gestures toward the hills and says that some locals believe spirits linger there, watching over the pastures. Historians still argue whether such beliefs are rooted in ancient animist traditions or later Buddhist influence, but here, it's just part of the landscape, like rocks or wind. A woman sitting nearby joins in, offering her own pot of tea. Hers is creamier, smoother, and she credits this to half-churn technique, stopping midway, letting the butter rest in the liquid, then finishing the churning later. It changes the texture, she insists, like velvet instead of wool. You take a sip and can't disagree. Someone produces a pouch of small, crunchy snacks made from roasted barley, dried into nuggets. These are meant to be nibbled between sips, their nutty bitterness balancing the tea's richness. A child runs past with a kite shaped like a fish, its tail whipping behind it, and suddenly the scene feels less like a ritual and more like an impromptu picnic. Midway through the morning, Dorj leans closer, lowering his voice to tell you about a tea oath tradition that used to exist. 2 people would share a cup and, by doing so, swear loyalty or resolve a conflict. No contracts, no papers, he says. Just tea. And you'd better mean it, because breaking a tea oath was unlucky. Whether this was a widely recognized custom or simply one valley's quirk is unclear, but the gravity in his tone suggests it was taken seriously. You look around and notice each person's tea has slight variations, one more salted, one paler, one spiced faintly with what smells like cardamom. It's like each kettle contains a personal signature. No two the same, yet all unmistakably part of the same tradition. At some point, your host produces the wildflower syrup from the ant's gift. You pass it around, and each person adds a cautious drop to their cup. The reaction is unanimous, murmurs of approval, and a few surprised smiles. Like drinking a sunny day, one man says. The fog eventually burns off, revealing the surrounding mountains in their full sharp relief. The air grows warmer, the kind that makes you shrug off your coat without realizing it. Conversations drift toward chores that need doing, fixing a fence, tending animals, but no one moves too quickly to leave. You sip your last mouthful of tea slowly, aware of how many hands have contributed to the moment, those who grew the barley, churned the butter, shaped the cups, told the stories. It strikes you that in this place, tea isn't just a drink, it's a shared language. Even without speaking Tibetan fluently, you've been conversing all morning in the grammar of cups and kettles. By the time the gathering winds down, the stoves have cooled to faint embers, and the leftover steam curls lazily upward like the last sentence of a good book. You help carry a kettle back toward the village, your fingers warmed by its sides, and realize you've learned something subtle yet important. In Tibetan butter tea culture, hospitality isn't about perfection, it's about participation. You step back inside the house, the faint scent of smoky milk still clinging to your coat, and set the kettle down, ready to brew another round. The village hums gently outside, and the day feels like it's just beginning. The days here start to feel elastic, slow and unhurried, but somehow full. By now, your body seems tuned to the rhythm of tea making without you even thinking about it. You wake, boil water, add the leaves, churn with butter and salt, and it's no longer a process you're learning, it's muscle memory. This morning, your host decides to take you to the monastery perched on a ridge just beyond the village. The air is thin up here, and the path winds through juniper bushes that crackle softly under the morning frost. Prayer flags whip overhead, snapping in bright bursts of color against a sky so clean it almost hurts your eyes. Inside the monastery's main hall, the scent of butter lamps greets you first, thick, warm, and faintly sweet. Rows of monks sit cross-legged on long cushions, their crimson robes pooling around them like liquid. You're led to a small side kitchen where an enormous kettle, big enough to bathe in, sits over a fire. This is the monastery's butter tea station, and the man in charge is a stocky monk with a shaved head and a grin like he's about to share a secret. He lets you help ladle the tea into tall brass pitchers, explaining that they'll be carried into the prayer hall during the morning chant. The tea here is stronger, more concentrated than anything you've tried in the village. Keeps the voices from cracking, he jokes, pouring you a sample. The salt feels sharper too, and the butter richer, almost caramel-like. You're given a tray and follow the line of servers into the hall. The sound inside is a low, steady hum, the monks chanting like a river moving under stone. You move from row to row, topping up each cup, and not a single monk pauses the chant to acknowledge you, yet the gratitude is palpable in the small nods and softened eyes. When your tray is empty, you step back into the courtyard. One of the younger monks joins you, sipping his tea in slow, deliberate mouthfuls. He tells you that some scholars believe butter tea originally traveled into Tibet along with Buddhism from the Tang dynasty trade routes, adapting to the high-altitude climate over centuries. But, he adds with a half-smile, others say it was born here, in the mountains, long before monks chanted in these halls. Historians still argue whether its roots are in religion or survival. You wander deeper into the monastery grounds, past a room where two monks are carving wooden teacups with geometric patterns. The wood shavings curl onto the floor like delicate scrolls, and the air smells faintly of pine resin. One monk explains that each cup is meant for one person alone. Sharing is done by pouring, never by drinking from the same vessel. A superstition, maybe, but one they keep alive. By midday, the wind has picked up. You're invited to sit with the kitchen staff for a quick meal, thick barley bread, a handful of dried apricots, and, of course, more tea. One cook, a wiry man with quick hands, tells you about winter reserves of tea bricks, stored high on shelves where damp can't reach them. He claims some bricks have lasted decades, still good if you scrape the surface. Whether that's safe or just bravado is unclear, but you file it under things you're not testing today. Before leaving, you return to the main hall. The chanting has slowed, becoming a single drawn-out note that seems to float in the rafters. You stand there for a moment, tea warmth in your belly, letting the sound wrap around you like a blanket. The walk back to the village is quieter. The path slopes downward, your legs moving more easily, but your mind feels heavier with the sense that you've stepped into something ancient and continuous. Butter tea isn't just a drink here, it's part of the machinery that keeps the community's days turning, linking villagers to monks, and monks to centuries past. Back in the kitchen, you set your kettle on the stove again, this time without thinking about it as making tea. It's just breathing now, another inhale and exhale in the rhythm of life up here. You stir slowly, watching the butter dissolve into soft swirls, and the thought occurs to you, the tea never really leaves, it just moves through hands, through cups, through years. Outside, the prayer flags still flick in the wind, carrying silent messages to the mountains. You imagine each flutter as a tiny toast, one more shared cup in the endless, invisible gathering. The morning starts slower than usual, like the air itself is asking you to linger. You can hear the faint clink of your host arranging cups before you've even opened your eyes. When you finally step outside, the village feels wrapped in cotton, low clouds drift between rooftops, softening every edge. Even the dogs are quieter, stretched out by doorways with lazy tails. You head to the hearth one last time. The kettle is already breathing steam, the water trembling just before it tips into a boil. Your host hands you the brick of tea with a small nod, letting you break it yourself. The crack echoes faintly in the room, as if the walls are leaning in to listen. You drop the shards into the pot, watching them bleed a slow, earthy red into the water. The steam curls around your fingers like an affectionate cat. A handful of salt follows, the grains vanishing almost instantly. You reach for the butter, golden and cool against your skin, and let it slide into the churning tea. The aroma is thicker than any perfume, warm enough to soften your shoulders. While the tea rolls and folds over itself, your host starts telling you about the autumn festival. It's a time when the whole village gathers, bringing butter tea in huge cauldrons to share with visitors from neighboring valleys. He says there's an unspoken competition over whose tea tastes best, but no one ever declares a winner, because the point isn't winning, it's remembering the year's harvest together. Historians still argue whether this tradition began as a Buddhist gathering or as a pragmatic way to feed travelers before winter storms closed the passes. Either way, it stayed because it works. When the tea is ready, you churn it one last time. The wooden handle fits in your hands as though it's been shaped by your own grip over decades. The movement is hypnotic, down, twist, lift, repeat, until the surface shimmers like satin. You pour the first cup for your host. He doesn't sip right away, just holds it in both hands, inhaling as though drawing in more than just tea. Then he gestures for you to take yours. The first mouthful is exactly how you remember it, salty, creamy, and grounding. But now, layered under the taste, there's something you didn't notice before, a quiet confidence, like the drink knows it belongs here and will outlast both you and the hands that made it. Outside, the clouds begin to break, letting sunlight spill over the barley fields. You step onto the porch with your cup, watching the light creep across the terraces. The air carries the scent of juniper smoke from a house down the slope. Somewhere, a prayer bell rings once, twice, and then fades into the distance. You realize you've learned more than how to make butter tea. You've learned the unhurried patience of the mountains, the easy generosity of a warm cup, and the way a shared ritual can bridge centuries without trying. You've seen that this drink isn't just a recipe, it's a thread in a much larger weaving, one that stretches across valleys and into the pages of history, frayed a little at the edges but holding strong. You finish your cup, setting it down gently on the worn table. Your host smiles, not the wide grin of greeting, but the soft smile of farewell. No words are exchanged, none are needed. You know, as you step back inside to help clean the cups, that the next time you taste this tea, whether here or far away, you'll feel this kitchen, this air, this slow rhythm settling back into your bones. And now, as the day drifts into its softer hours, you let your thoughts loosen. The clinking of cups fades, replaced by the small, steady sounds of a village winding down, the shuffle of feet on stone, the faint splash of water poured into a basin, the hush of distant voices. The kettle on the stove exhales one last ribbon of steam before the fire is banked low. In the quiet, you can hear your own breathing syncing with the gentle crackle of the embers. Every sound seems wrapped in wool, dulled to a soothing murmur. You step outside again, just far enough to see the sun leaning toward the horizon. The sky glows in layers, amber melting into lavender, then deepening to a blue so rich it seems to drink the light. A few prayer flags flutter at the roofline, their colors softened by time, each movement a slow heartbeat. The air is cool now, brushing against your face with the lightest touch. Somewhere in the distance, a yak bell rings, slow, uneven, as though the animal itself is half asleep. The sound fades and returns with the wind, like a lullaby without a fixed melody. You take a seat on the worn wooden step, letting the day's weight settle out of your shoulders. Your fingers still carry a faint trace of butter, and your clothes hold the memory of smoke. They are small things, but together they form a cocoon, a reminder of every moment you've spent here. The light thins, and with it, the village seems to breathe slower. Shadows stretch lazily across the terraces, blurring their sharp edges until fields and footpaths melt into one another. Even the dogs seem to sense the shift, curling into tighter shapes by their doorways. You picture tomorrow morning, when this kitchen will wake again to the sound of boiling water and the scrape of tea bricks. It will happen without you, but that doesn't make it any less real. This is how traditions survive, through repetition, through hands that learn without needing to be told, through moments too ordinary to be written down yet too essential to forget. Somewhere in your mind, you still hear the churner moving up and down, the rhythmic swish of liquid folding into itself. It becomes a kind of metronome for your thoughts, slowing each one before it slips into the next. The sun finally drops behind the ridge, and the sky deepens to a velvety dark. A single star appears, then another, until the whole dome overhead is pricked with light. The air is cooler now, the kind that makes you tuck your hands inside your sleeves without thinking. You take one last look at the village, its shapes dim but still familiar. The houses huddle together as if for warmth, smoke from their chimneys rising in thin, silver ribbons. Somewhere, someone is probably making tea right now, the steam curling up to join the evening air. You close your eyes and let the image settle, not as a sharp snapshot, but as a soft painting, all edges blurred. In that space between waking and sleep, you hold the feeling of this place like a warm cup between your palms. The sounds grow softer still. The air feels heavier, in the way it does just before you drift. And as you lean into that weight, the thought comes, quiet, certain, that the tea will be waiting, in some form, whenever you return. Not rushing. Not changing. Just there.